Hey there and welcome back. If you are settling in now, the lamps turned low, the day at last loosening its grip on you, then you have come to the right place. There is a particular weariness the body carries that the mind is often the last to notice, and tonight you are allowed to lay every ounce of it down. Tonight asks nothing of you but stillness, and in return it offers you a life. One human life, lived 4.5 centuries ago, carried from its first breath in a snowbound palace to its last cold morning on a scaffold. We are going to spend these hours with Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, a woman who was a crowned queen before she could lift her own head from the cradle, a woman who wore 3 crowns and buried 2 husbands and lost a third to the executioner, a woman who would herself, at the close of a life almost too dramatic to be believed, kneel down in a hole in the English Midlands and lay her neck upon a block. There is a little dog in that final scene, hidden where no one thought to look. We will reach it in time. For now I want you only to hold one image, a woman in a black gown who, when the gown was lifted away, stood revealed in red from throat to hem, and who never once explained what she meant by it. Before we go any further, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight, and what the hour is where you are. It is a fitting thing to ask of the woman we are about to follow, because Mary spent the better part of 2 decades writing letters by candlelight, thousands of them, to people scattered through Europe whom she would never meet again, in places she would never see again, asking after their health and their weather and their faith. She understood, as well as anyone who has ever lived, what it is to send words out into the dark toward distant strangers, and to hope they land somewhere kind. So tell me, if you would like, in a line or 2 where you are sitting. I read what you leave, and if you find that these slow evenings of history are something you would like to return to, you are very welcome to stay and to subscribe so that the next of them finds its way to you when it comes. Now let us go back. Picture a palace in the lowlands of Scotland in the deep of winter. Linlithgow it was called, and is called still, a tall courtyard fortress of grey stone set above a frozen loch, halfway along the road that runs between Edinburgh and Stirling. The date is the 8th of December, 1542. Snow lies heavy on the parkland and on the roofs of the little burg below, and within the palace, a young queen has just been delivered of her 3rd child, and her only one to live, a daughter. The mother is Marie de Guise, a French woman of one of the most formidable families in Europe. The father is James V, King of Scots, and he is not in the room. He lies 40 miles off at Falkland, and he is dying, not of any wound but of something nearer to a broken spirit, having watched his army dissolve into rout and surrender at a marshy stretch of border called Solway Moss a fortnight earlier. When word is brought to him that his wife has borne a girl and not the son the kingdom needed, he is said to have turned his face away and murmured that the crown had come to his house with a lass, and would pass from it with a lass. Whether he truly said it, we cannot know. He was dead within the week. And so this newborn girl, 6 days old, became Mary, Queen of Scots, sovereign of an ancient and quarrelsome kingdom, while she was still being swaddled against the cold. That's where we begin, with a baby and a death and a prophecy that the centuries would not let go of. And I will tell you now, so that you carry it gently through everything that follows, that almost nothing in this life will be simple, and almost nothing will be fair, and yet the woman at the centre of it will meet each turn of the wheel with a courage that even her enemies came to admire. Let your breathing slow. Let the room go still. We have a long way to travel, and we will take it without hurry. It is worth pausing, before we go on, to understand the country this child had just inherited, because Scotland in the middle of the 1500s was not a place that made life easy for any monarch, let alone an infant one. It was a poor kingdom by the measure of its southern neighbour, thinly peopled, its wealth held in land and cattle rather than in coin, its great families wielding a power that often rivaled the crown's own. Where England under the Tudors had spent decades pulling authority inward toward the throne, Scotland remained a federation of proud and armed lordships, the Hamiltons and the Douglases and the Gordons and the Campbells, each commanding its own region and its own men, each capable of making or unmaking a government. A child sovereign meant a regency, and a regency meant a prize, and the prize was the right to rule in the infant's name, and to marry her, in time, to whatever advantage could be wrung from her. From the hour of her birth, then, Mary was less a person than a possession, the most valuable single object in the kingdom, and the men around her cradle were already calculating what she might be worth. To the south sat England, and England had a king who wanted her. Henry VIII was by this point an aging, suspicious, enormous man, but his eye for advantage had not dimmed, and he saw at once what the death of James V had laid open to him. He had a son of his own, Prince Edward, 5 years old. He had a neighbouring kingdom suddenly governed by a baby girl. The arithmetic was obvious. Marry the Scottish Queen to the English Prince, and the two crowns that had glared at each other across a contested border for centuries might at last be joined, with the joining done on English terms and an English heir sitting one day over both. Henry pressed for it hard, and for a brief season in 1543 it seemed he might have it, for a treaty was signed at Greenwich that promised Mary to Edward when she came of age. But the Scots, on reflection, did not care for the bargain. They feared with reason that what looked like a marriage was in truth a swallowing, that their small, fierce, independent country would be folded quietly into England and lose itself. The treaty was repudiated, and Henry, who did not take refusal kindly from anyone, and took it least kindly of all in his last violent years, responded in the manner that came most naturally to him. He sent armies north to take by fire what he could not gain by ink. The campaign that followed has come down to us under a grimly tender name. The rough wooing, later generations called it, as though the burning of the Scottish lowlands were a kind of brutal courtship, which in a sense it was meant to be. English forces crossed the border and put Edinburgh to the torch, sacked the abbeys of the borders, Melrose and Dryburgh and Jedburgh and Kelso, and laid waste the farmland of the Lothians, season after season, in a deliberate effort to make the Scots so weary of war that they would hand over their queen simply to make it stop. It did not work. It rarely does. Cruelty applied to a proud people tends to harden them rather than bend them, and the chief result of the rough wooing was to drive Scotland for protection into the arms of its oldest friend and England's oldest enemy. The old alliance, the long understanding between Scotland and France, was renewed and deepened, and the men governing in Mary's name made a decision that would shape the whole course of her life. They would not give the child to England. They would give her, instead, to France. Through all of this the Queen herself, of course, knew nothing. She was an infant, then a toddler, carried from one stronghold to another for safety, crowned at Stirling Castle in September of 1543, at the age of 9 months, in a ceremony she could not possibly remember, the heavy crown held above her tiny head because she could not bear its weight. One who was present remarked that she cried throughout, which observers chose to read, as people will, as an omen. Her mother Marie de Guise stood at the centre of the storm with the steadiness that deserves our respect. A foreigner in a hostile land, recently widowed, guarding a daughter who was the only thing standing between her and irrelevance, she navigated the feuding Scottish lords with a patience and a political intelligence that would, in the years to come, see her rise to the regency herself, and hold the kingdom together by sheer force of will. She is one of 3 women I want you to keep in your mind as we go, because the shape of Mary's life was drawn in large part by women. Her mother, who guarded her beginning, a cousin in England, whom she would never meet and who would one day sign her death, and a hard, brilliant Englishwoman who would keep her late in life as a kind of treasured prisoner. Hold them lightly. We will come back to each. For now the decision was made, and a fleet was made ready, and in the summer of 1548 a small girl of 5 was taken down to the water and put aboard a ship bound for France. She would not set foot in Scotland again for 13 years. When she returned she would be a grown woman, a widow, a queen twice over, and a stranger to her own kingdom, speaking its language haltingly and understanding its bitter religious divisions hardly at all. But that is to leap ahead, and we are not going to leap. We are going to take this life as she lived it, one season at a time, and the next season, the one that would form her more deeply than any other, was about to begin on the far side of the sea, at the most glittering and dangerous court in Europe. The France that received Mary Stuart in the autumn of 1548 was the wealthiest and most cultivated realm in Christendom, and the court of its king, Henry II, was the brightest jewel within it. After the grey austerity of a Scottish childhood spent moving between draughty fortresses, the little queen was set down into a world of warmth and colour and abundance that must have seemed scarcely believable. Chateaux rose along the rivers of the Loire Valley, with their pale stone and their conical towers and their formal gardens laid out in patterns you could read like writing. There were tapestries on every wall, and silver on every table, and music in every library. There were libraries and dancing masters and falconers and poets. And into this paradise the French king folded Mary with a tenderness that surprised everyone, for Henry took to her at once, declaring her the most perfect child he had ever seen, and ordering that she be raised alongside his own children as though she were one of them. She was betrothed on arrival to the eldest of those children, the Dauphin Francis, the boy who would one day be King of France. He was a year her junior, a frail and sickly child, shy and slow to grow, and the 2 of them formed from the start the kind of bond that small children form when they are told they belong to each other. Mary, taller and quicker and more confident, mothered him a little. He adored her. They were playmates before they were anything else, and the affection between them, whatever else can be said about the strange arrangement that had bound them, seems to have been real. She would be the only one of his companions who could coax him out of his fearfulness, and he would cling to her presence all his short life. I want you to understand what these French years did to her, because they explain a great deal about everything that came after. Mary was raised French. She thought in French, prayed in French, wrote her most intimate letters in French to the end of her days. She was educated to a standard that few women of any rank in that century could match, schooled in Latin and Italian and Spanish, in poetry and rhetoric and music, taught to dance and to ride and to hunt with a fearless grace that observers never stopped remarking upon. She grew tall, unusually so for a woman of her age, eventually reaching very near 6 feet, with the reddish gold hair and the heavy-lidded eyes that the portraitists loved. She was, by every account that survives, charming in a way that went beyond mere beauty, possessed of a warmth and an ease and a quickness of feeling that drew people to her and made them want to serve her. These were gifts. They were also, as we shall see, dangers, for a queen who rules by charm is helpless when charm is not enough, and a woman raised to believe that affection can be relied upon will be wounded again and again by a world that runs on harder things. And there was something else the French years gave her, something that would prove the deepest fault line of her life. They made her a Catholic to the marrow. Her education, her devotions, her entire moral universe were shaped by the old faith, at the very moment when, far to the north, the country she nominally ruled was tearing itself away from that faith forever. While Mary knelt in the candlelit chapels of the Loire, Scotland was sliding toward Reformation, toward a fierce and uncompromising Protestantism that would come to regard the Mass as idolatry and the Pope as Antichrist, and a Catholic monarch as a standing threat to the soul of the nation. The girl being so lovingly raised in France was being made, all unknowing, into precisely the kind of sovereign her future subjects would least be able to abide. No one intended this, but it was happening, and it would cost her everything. I want to linger a little in these French years before we move on, because they were, in a sense, the only truly happy stretch of her whole life, and because the genre of this evening is not only what happened, but what it felt like to be alive inside it. So picture the days of her girlhood. Picture a great chateau on a slow green river, its towers reflected in the water, its courtyards loud with the business of a court that numbered in the hundreds. The mornings began with devotions in a chapel, heavy with incense and candle smoke, the light coming coloured through tall windows, the Latin of the Mass as familiar to her as her own breath. Then lessons, for she was educated as few women of her century would ever be, sitting over her Latin and her Italian, her music and her dancing, her embroidery and her verse, under tutors who found in her a quick and willing pupil. She learned to ride as the French nobility rode, hard and fearless, and to fly hawks, and to dance the elaborate dances of the court with a grace that drew every eye. She was praised constantly, petted, admired, told from her earliest years that she was beautiful and clever, and destined for the highest place. And a child told such things daily comes to believe them, and to expect that the world will go on telling them forever. The court moved with the seasons, from one chateau to another, a vast, slow migration of people and furniture and tapestries along the roads of the Loire, and Mary moved with it, at the centre of a little band of companions her own age. The food was rich beyond anything Scotland could offer. The clothing was of silk and cloth of gold. The talk was of poetry and love, and the latest fashions out of Italy, and the whole golden machine of it ran on the unspoken assumption that this was simply how life was and would remain. I think it is worth dwelling on this, because it explains so much of what came after. Mary was formed by abundance and affection and security, in a world where she was the cherished jewel of the most powerful court in Europe, and she was sent from it, when the time came, into a kingdom of cold stone and hard preaching and armed and jealous men who regarded her as a threat. She spent the rest of her life, in a way, looking for France again, for the warmth and the love and the certainty she had known there, and never finding it, and trusting the wrong people in the search. The girl who grew up being loved without condition was poorly armoured for a world that loved nothing without calculation, and there were her companions, the small constant fellowship that would follow her through everything. When she had first been sent to France as a child of 5, 4 little girls of the Scottish nobility had been sent with her to be her playmates and her household, and by a charming chance all four bore the same name as their mistress. They were the four Maries, Mary Beaton and Mary Seton and Mary Fleming and Mary Livingston, and they grew up alongside the Queen as her closest friends, the one stable element in a life of upheaval. They had crossed the sea with her as children. Some of them would cross it again with her when she went home. One of them, Mary Seton, the most faithful of all, would stay with her into the long years of captivity, dressing her hair and tending her through illness, refusing for decades to leave her side, until her own health finally broke and she could serve no more. There is a kind of love in that constancy that the politics of the age makes all the more remarkable. Four women who, asked as children to belong to a queen, kept that promise across 40 years and 3 kingdoms and every reversal of fortune. When we picture Mary alone on her prison island or bent over her embroidery in the English Midlands, we should remember that she was rarely entirely alone, that there were always these few who had chosen her and would not unchoose her, and that whatever else she lost, she never wholly lost the gift of being loved by those who knew her best. The marriage came when she was 15. On a brilliant April morning in 1558, Mary Stuart was married to the Dauphin Francis before the great doors of Notre Dame in Paris, in a spectacle of such extravagance that the chroniclers struggled to find words for it. She wore white, which was a bold and unusual choice, for white was then the colour of mourning among French queens, and some who saw it whispered that it was unlucky. She did not care. She was radiant, and she knew it, and the people of Paris pressed in their thousands to catch a glimpse of the tall young queen who would one day be their own. By this single ceremony she became something almost unique in Europe, a reigning queen in her own right of Scotland and the future queen consort of France. The two destinies bound up in one slender 15-year-old who had not yet seen anything of life beyond the protected gardens in which she had been raised. Whatever private bargains had been struck behind the splendour, and there were some, including secret documents in which Mary signed away Scotland to France should she die without an heir, a transaction she barely understood and almost certainly should not have made. The public meaning of the day was plain. The old alliance had reached its consummation. France and Scotland were to be joined in the persons of this boy and this girl, and England, watching from across the Channel, had reason to be afraid, for Mary's claim did not stop at Scotland. Through her grandmother, who had been a Tudor princess and the sister of Henry VIII, Mary stood very near indeed to the English throne itself. In the eyes of every Catholic in Europe who did not recognise Henry's divorce or the marriage that produced his daughter Elizabeth, Mary was not merely near to that throne, she was its rightful occupant. And when, a few months after her wedding, the Protestant Elizabeth became Queen of England on the death of her half-sister, the French king did something that would poison the rest of Mary's life. He ordered that his new daughter-in-law and his son should quarter the royal arms of England with their own, proclaiming to all the world that they, and not Elizabeth, were the true sovereigns of England. Tanan. Mary was 16, and the gesture was not hers. It was her father-in-law's, made for reasons of French statecraft she had no part in shaping, but it was done in her name and over her image, and Elizabeth never forgot it, never forgave it, and never afterward fully trusted the cousin who had, however unwillingly, laid public claim to her crown. Here, at the very beginning, before the two women had ever exchanged a word, the wound was opened that would in the end prove mortal. I find it one of the saddest threads in the whole tangled story, this enmity between two queens who might, in another life, have been each other's only true equals and confidants, the only two women in the world who could have understood what the other carried. They would write to each other for nearly 30 years. They would scheme and plead and threaten, and now and then reach toward something like tenderness, and they would never once stand in the same room. We will keep returning to Elizabeth, the cousin and the mirror and the shadow, all the way to the final morning. For now she is only a name in the distance, newly crowned, watching the French announce that a 16-year-old girl is the real Queen of England, and quietly resolving never to lower her guard. The glittering years did not last. Nothing in this life lasts, and the gold of the French court was about to turn with terrible swiftness to a long succession of graves. In the summer of 1559, scarcely a year after the wedding, King Henry II rode in a tournament held to celebrate a season of royal weddings and took a lance through the visor of his helmet. He lingered for 10 agonizing days, and then he died. And in that instant everything changed. The frail boy Francis, not yet 16, was King of France, and Mary Stuart, at 16, was its queen. She was now sovereign of 2 kingdoms, the most exalted young woman in Europe, and on paper she stood at the summit of the continent. But the reality beneath the paper was already crumbling. Francis was not made to rule. He was a sickly adolescent, dominated by his formidable mother, Catherine de' Medici, and by Mary's own ambitious uncles, the brothers of the House of Guise, who saw in their niece's elevation the chance to govern France themselves. The real power flowed around the boy king, not through him, and his health, never strong, began visibly to fail. For Mary these were months lived on the edge of a precipice. She could not yet see clearly, all outward magnificence and inward dread. The young queen presiding over a court that was quietly calculating how long her husband would survive, and what would become of her when he did not. The answer came with brutal speed. In the late autumn of 1560, Francis fell ill with what seems to have been an infection of the ear that spread, in an age without remedy, to something fatal. He suffered terribly. Mary nursed him with a devotion that no one doubted, sitting with him hour after hour, but there was nothing to be done, and in December of 1560 he died, not yet 17 years old. Mary was 18. She was a widow, and almost overnight she was nothing in France at all. That last point is the cruel hinge of this part of her story, and it is worth sitting with for a moment in the quiet of the evening. While Francis lived, Mary was Queen of France, the First Lady of the realm, mistress of a court. The day he died she became merely the king's widow, and a new king, Francis's 10-year-old brother Charles, took the throne, with their mother Catherine de' Medici as regent. And Catherine, who had spent years swallowing her resentment of the beautiful daughter-in-law who outshone her, had no further use for Mary now and made the fact plain. There was no place for her in France any longer. Her great match had ended in a grave. The country that had raised her and that she loved as her home no longer wanted her. And so, at 18, having in the space of a single year buried her father-in-law, her mother and her husband, Mary Stuart turned her face north, toward a cold and divided kingdom she scarcely remembered, full of subjects she did not know, who worshipped in a manner she found abhorrent, and who were waiting to see what manner of queen would come to them out of the south. For a season after Francis died, she lingered in France in deep mourning, and the image of her in those months became one of the most celebrated of her whole life, fixed in paint and in poetry, the young widowed queen in white. White was the colour of royal mourning in France, and Mary wore it, and she was painted in it, pale and grave and luminous beneath a white veil and hood, so that she was known for a time as La Reine Blanche, the White Queen. And the poets of the French court, who had grown up praising her beauty now, turned their verses to her sorrow, lamenting that so much grace should be so soon clouded by grief. There is a tenderness in those poems that reaches across the centuries, the great writers of the age mourning the departure of the girl who had been the ornament of their court, knowing that she was leaving them, knowing that the cold north was taking her back, and that the brilliant creature they had watched grow up among them would not be seen again. She was 19, and she had buried a husband she had known since childhood, the frail boy she had mothered and protected, and who had clung to her all his short life, and whatever the marriage had been in the cold terms of statecraft, the loss of him seems to have been a true grief. The loss of the last thread that bound her to the only happy world she had known, and with him gone, all else unravelled at once. The crown of France passed to a child, the power passed to a mother-in-law who had never loved her, and the White Queen found herself, almost overnight, a widow without a throne, mourning in a court that no longer had a place for her, surrounded by the beauty of a country that was quietly turning her out. It is no wonder she wept on the deck of the ship that carried her away. She was not only leaving France, she was leaving her girlhood and her happiness, and the only version of her life in which she had been simply and securely loved, and she was sailing toward everything that would break her. The White Queen of those mourning portraits is, in a sense, the last image of the Mary who was still whole. All that followed would be struggle and loss, and the slow turning of the wheel toward the dark. The departure itself, when it came, has become one of the most remembered scenes of her life, and it deserves to be told slowly, because it marks the true end of her happiness and the beginning of everything else. She had lingered in France for the better part of a year after Francis died, a widow of 18 with no clear place, while the courts of Europe debated her future, and her own future was decided around her rather than by her. She might have stayed. There was talk of other matches, other crowns, but France, under its new boy king and its watchful Queen Mother, had quietly closed against her, and Scotland, her own kingdom, was sending word that its queen should come home and rule. And so, with great reluctance, she resolved to go back to the cold country she had left as a child of 5 and could scarcely remember, to govern a people she did not know in a faith she did not share. On an August morning in 1561, she went down to the harbour at Calais and boarded the galley that would carry her north, and as the ship pulled away from the quay and out into the open water, she did a thing that those who saw it never forgot. She would not go below. She stood at the stern of the vessel, gazing back at the receding coast of France, at the land that had raised her and loved her and made her what she was, and she wept, and she said over and over, a farewell that has come down to us across the centuries. "Adieu, France," she said. "Adieu, France. It is over. I think I shall never see you more." She stayed there as the daylight failed, refusing food, refusing to leave the deck, watching the shore until the dark swallowed it. And when at last she lay down, it was on a couch brought up to the open air, with orders that she be woken at first light if the coast of France were still in view. It was. At dawn the wind had dropped and the galley had made little progress, and the low blue line of France lay still upon the horizon, and Mary rose and went again to the rail, and looked her last upon it, and said her farewell once more, and then it was gone, and she turned her face toward Scotland, and toward the whole long tragedy that awaited her there. I find that scene almost unbearably moving, and I think it is because she was right. She never did see France again. Everything she loved was behind her on that horizon, and everything that would destroy her lay ahead, and some part of her, standing at the stern of that galley at the age of 18, seems to have known it. We talk a great deal, in telling this life, of her errors and her misfortunes, of the bad marriages and the worst decisions, and there is truth in all of it. But it is worth pausing before she lands and the hard years begin, to feel the simple human weight of what she was doing. A young widow was leaving the only home she had ever truly known, going alone in obedience to duty, to take up a burden she had not asked for in a place that did not want her, and she was grieving as she went, openly, on the deck of a ship, in front of everyone, because she could not help it. The queen of the placards and the casket letters and the murder plots is a hard figure to love. The girl at the rail saying goodbye to France and weeping because she would never see it again is not hard to love at all. They are the same person. We should hold both of them as we go on. The crossing itself was uneasy. The late summer seas of the north grey and unfriendly after the warm Mediterranean light she had grown up in, and there was danger besides, for English ships were known to be abroad, and Elizabeth had not granted her cousin a safe conduct through English waters, so that the Scottish galleys ran for home, half expecting to be intercepted by the navy of the Queen, who already mistrusted her. They were not intercepted, whether by luck or by Elizabeth's quiet permission, and after some days the fog of the Scottish coast closed around them, and Mary came home to a country she would have to learn from the beginning. A queen of 19 who had been a child when she left, and was now a widow, a sovereign, and a stranger, all at once. What she made of that homecoming, and what it made of her, is where the rest of her story truly begins. She landed at Leith, the port of Edinburgh, on a morning in August of 1561, and the sea itself seemed to mark the strangeness of her homecoming, for a thick the cold grey fog of the Scottish coast, lay so heavy on the water that her ships felt their way blind toward the shore. She came almost unannounced, earlier than expected, and there was confusion on the quayside, no proper welcome ready, the Queen of Scots stepping ashore into her own kingdom, as though she was slipping in by a side door. The contrast with the France she had left could not have been crueler. Behind her the warmth and music and abundance of the Loire. Before her a fog-bound northern town, a populace she did not know, and a faith that regarded her as a danger. She wept, some said, when the mist would not lift. Whether for the husband she had buried, or the country she had lost, or the one she was entering, no one could say. To understand the country that now closed around her, we must understand what had happened in it while she was away, because the Scotland of 1561 had been remade root and branch in the 13 years of her absence, and the woman chiefly responsible for holding it together through that remaking had been her own mother. While Mary grew up in the warmth of France, Marie de Guise had stayed behind in the cold, guarding her daughter's kingdom with a tenacity that deserves to be remembered far better than it is. In the time after Mary was sent away, Marie manoeuvred herself, by patience and cunning and the steady backing of France, into the regency of Scotland, governing the realm in her absent daughter's name, and she governed it ably, and in the teeth of fearful odds, a Frenchwoman ruling a foreign and faction-ridden country that did not love her, and grew, as the years passed, to resent the French soldiers and French officials with whom she surrounded herself. For the great wave that was rising in Scotland through those decades was religious, and it was rising against everything Marie de Guise stood for. The Protestant Reformation, which had already swept much of northern Europe, was taking fierce hold among the Scottish nobility and the common people of the towns, fed by preachers like Knox who had returned from exile breathing fire, and by a growing conviction that the old church was corrupt and the French connection a foreign yoke. A group of the great lords banded together under the name of the Lords of the Congregation, pledging themselves to defend the new faith and to drive out the French, and by the closing years of the 1550s Scotland was sliding toward open civil war between the Catholic French-backed regency of Marie de Guise and the Protestant lords who increasingly looked south to Elizabeth's England for help. It is one of the sharp ironies of the age that the Protestant English Queen, who had every reason to fear a strong Scotland, found it in her interest to support the Scottish rebels opposing the French regent, and so English money and eventually English troops came north to aid the lords of the Congregation against the mother of the very Queen whom Elizabeth would one day put to death. The crisis came to its head in the spring of 1560. English forces laid siege to the French garrison at Leith, the same port where Mary would land the following year, and Marie de Guise, ill and exhausted and shut up in Edinburgh Castle, watched her cause collapse around her. She did not live to see the end of it. In June of 1560 she died, worn out by years of struggle, and with her death the French position in Scotland fell apart. A treaty was signed. The French and English troops both withdrew, and the field was left to the Protestant lords, who promptly summoned a parliament that abolished the authority of the Pope, forbade the Mass, and adopted the Reformed faith as the religion of the realm. All of this happened in the months before Francis died in France, so that Mary, when she at last turned for home, was sailing toward a kingdom that had, in her absence and over her mother's dying resistance, repudiated her religion entirely and remade itself into precisely the kind of country least able to accept a Catholic queen. Her mother had spent her life holding Scotland for her and had died in the holding, and the Scotland she had died to preserve no longer existed. That was the inheritance waiting at Leith. The Scotland she returned to had, in her absence, become a Protestant nation, and not gently. In the year before her return, a Reformation Parliament had abolished the authority of the Pope, forbidden the celebration of the Mass, and adopted a confession of faith that swept away 1,000 years of Catholic practice. The driving force behind this transformation was a preacher of ferocious conviction named John Knox, a man who had spent years in exile, had served on the French galleys as a prisoner, and had returned to Scotland breathing fire against what he called the idolatry of Rome. Knox did not merely dislike the old faith. He believed it damnable, a road to hell, and he believed that a Catholic monarch was a snare set for the souls of the people. He had already published a furious tract against the very idea of women rulers, aimed chiefly at the Catholic queens of England and Scotland and France, with a title so memorable that it has outlived almost everything else he wrote, A Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women. Into this man's city and this man's revolution the young Catholic queen now walked. Try for a moment to feel the loneliness of her position in those first months home, because it was profound, and it goes a long way toward explaining the warmth and the trust she would later place, so disastrously, in the wrong people. She had come back to a country she did not know to rule a people whose language she spoke imperfectly, and whose hard new religion she found not merely strange but spiritually abhorrent. She had left France, where she was adored, where she had been the centre of a loving and brilliant world, and she had arrived in a place where the most powerful voice in the land denounced her from the pulpit as a danger to the souls of her subjects, where great armed lords eyed her crown as a prize to be won, where her own faith had to be practised in secret and in fear. She was 19 years old, a widow, and almost entirely alone save for the handful of French servants and the faithful companions who had crossed the sea with her. When she had Mass said in her private chapel on her first Sunday in Scotland, a crowd gathered in fury and very nearly broke in upon the service, and her own half-brother had to stand in the chapel doorway to keep the mob from the altar, and the priest and the servers went about in terror of their lives. Imagine the message of that to a young queen newly come home, that the simple practice of the faith in which she had been raised, the faith of her mother and her childhood and her dead husband, could not be carried out in her own palace without a riot at the door. She wept often in those early months by the accounts that survive, and small wonder. She was a stranger in her own kingdom, surrounded by people who distrusted her, denied the open practice of her religion, mourning the husband and the country she had lost, and required, despite all of it, to be a ruler, to be strong, to govern men twice her age, who would have governed her instead if she gave them the smallest opening. That she did not break under it, that she found within herself the resources to rule with patience and intelligence for several years, is a thing we should remember when we come to judge her later errors. She was working without a net, friendless at the top of a hostile world, and reaching always for the warmth she had lost, which is perhaps why, when a tall and charming young man came north and paid court to her, she fell so far and so fast. What she did next tells us a great deal about her, and about the kind of ruler she might have become in a kinder age. She did not attempt to roll back the Reformation. She did not insist that her subjects return to the Mass. She asked only one thing, that she be permitted to worship in private, in her own chapel, according to her own conscience, while leaving the new religion of her kingdom untouched. It was, by the standards of that savage century, a position of remarkable moderation, and it has earned her, from later historians, a reputation for a tolerance that was genuinely ahead of her time. She wanted to rule a Protestant country as a private Catholic. She wanted, in essence, to keep her faith and her crown both, and to let her people keep theirs. In a different country, in a calmer decade, it might have worked. It did not work, because Knox would not allow it to. When word spread that Mass had been said in the Queen's chapel on her first Sunday home, the preacher thundered from his pulpit that one Mass was more terrible to him than 10,000 armed invaders landed to suppress the true religion. And so began one of the more extraordinary relationships in the whole story, the series of face-to-face confrontations between the young Queen and the old Reformer, in which Mary, barely 19, summoned Knox to her presence again and again to reason with him, to charm him, to weep at him, to argue scripture and sovereignty and the rights of conscience, and Knox stood before her unmoved, immovable, a wall of granite certainty against which all her warmth and all her tears broke and ran off. He recorded these meetings himself, with evident satisfaction, and reading his account across the centuries, one cannot help but feel for her, this clever, lonely, well-meaning young woman trying every instrument she possessed, reason and emotion and royal command alike, against a man who had decided in advance that she was an enemy of God and could not be persuaded otherwise. She left at least one of their encounters in tears. He noted it without pity. The confrontations with Knox deserve a closer look, because they are among the few moments where we can almost hear Mary's own voice across the centuries, and because they show us both her gifts and the limits of those gifts with painful clarity. The old Reformer recorded their meetings himself, and though his account is hostile and self-serving, written to display his own unbending righteousness, it cannot quite hide the figure of the young Queen on the other side of the table, and that figure is worth attending to. She summoned him to her presence more than once, this preacher who denounced her religion from the pulpit and who had written that the rule of women was a monstrous thing against nature, and she did not summon him to threaten or to silence him, though she had the power to do both. She summoned him to reason with him, to argue, to try, by every means she possessed, to win him over, or at least to soften him, and the means she possessed were considerable. She was clever and well read in matters of faith, and she could argue scripture and history with him point for point. She was charming, and she deployed her charm, and when argument and charm both failed, she wept openly the tears of a young woman who could not understand why this man would not be moved. And Knox was not moved, not by any of it. He met her arguments with harder arguments, her charm with stony indifference, her tears with a chilly little homily on how he had never delighted in the weeping of any creature, but could not betray the truth of God to spare a queen's feelings. He told her to her face that subjects might resist, and even restrain a ruler who acted against God, which was very nearly a justification of rebellion spoken to a reigning monarch in her own chamber, and he did not flinch in the saying of it. Reading these encounters, one feels the collision of two utterly different conceptions of the world: the queen who believed that sovereigns were owed obedience, and that disagreements might be smoothed by goodwill and reason and the personal bond between people, and the preacher who believed that he served a higher king than any earthly one, and that no charm or rank or weeping could weigh a feather against the commands of God as he understood them. She could not reach him, because there was nothing in him to reach by the means she knew. Her whole armoury, the warmth and the wit and the appeal to common feeling that had won over the French court and would win over so many others, was useless against a man who had decided in advance that she was an enemy of heaven. She left their last great interview in tears, and he recorded the tears without a flicker of pity, and in that small, cruel detail you can see the shape of her whole tragedy laid out in miniature. A woman who ruled by love, attempting to govern a world that did not run on love at all. For all that, the early years of her personal rule were not a disaster, and this is something that the later legend of Mary as a doomed and hapless figure tends to obscure. She governed, on the whole, well. She leaned heavily on the counsel of two men in particular, her own half-brother, James Stuart, an able and ambitious illegitimate son of her father, whom she made Earl of Moray, and a subtle career statesman named William Maitland of Lethington, whom contemporaries nicknamed the chameleon for his gift of adapting to any circumstance. Under their guidance, and with her own considerable political instincts, Mary held a precarious balance. She kept the peace between the great factions. She made progresses through her kingdom, showing herself to her people, who by most accounts were charmed by their tall and gracious young queen, even when they distrusted her religion. She hunted and danced and presided over a court that, while it could never rival the France she pined for, brought a measure of culture and gaiety to Edinburgh that the dower capital had not known. For a few years the wheel seemed to have stopped turning. The trouble, when it came, would not come from Knox or from the Lords or from England. It would come, as it so often did in Mary's life, from the matter of her marriage. For a few years, though, before the marriages and the murders, that there was something like an ordinary reign, and I want to give you its texture, because it is the nearest thing to peace that her adult life contained. Picture Edinburgh in the early 1560s, a steep grey city climbing its ridge from the fortress on the rock down to the palace at the foot, the tall tenements crowding the single great thoroughfare, the smoke of 10,000 fires hanging over the rooftops, the salt wind coming up from the Firth. At the lower end stood Holyrood House, the Queen's own palace, and there Mary kept her court, and for a little while she made of that dour northern capital something it had rarely been, a place of music and dancing and a measure of grace. She had brought France home with her in her tastes and her household, her French servants and French furnishings, her love of fine clothes and good food and elegant entertainment, and the sober burghers of Edinburgh did not always know what to make of a queen who danced late and dressed in the latest French fashion and kept poets and musicians about her. Knox, of course, disapproved thunderously of all of it, the dancing above all, which he regarded as a snare of the devil, and he and the Queen clashed over it as they clashed over everything. Her days were filled with the steady business of governing, the audiences and the council meetings, the reading and signing of documents, the receiving of ambassadors and petitioners, the slow, patient work of holding a fractious kingdom together. She rode out often, for she loved the open air and the chase, and she made long progresses through her realm, travelling north and west into parts of Scotland that had not seen their sovereign in living memory, showing herself to her people, who came out to look upon their tall young queen with a curiosity that was by most accounts more friendly than hostile. She hunted, she played at cards and at billiards, she practised her music, she bent over her embroidery in the evenings, that lifelong solace, with her women about her. It was, in its way, a good life, and had it been allowed to continue, had she ruled out her years as a competent and gracious queen presiding over a settling kingdom, history would remember her very differently, as a successful monarch, rather than a tragic one. But the matter of her marriage hung over all of it, unresolved and dangerous, and around the edges of the music and the hunting the hard men of her kingdom went on calculating, and the wheel, which had paused, was only gathering itself to turn again. For the great unanswered question that hung over everything was this: whom would the Queen wed? She was young, she was a sovereign in her own right, and she had no heir, and until she produced one, the future of the kingdom was open and dangerous. Every court in Europe took an interest. Catholic Spain considered her, the House of Austria considered her, and the whole question was bound up, as so much in Mary's life was bound up, with England and with the cousin who sat upon the throne Mary still, in the eyes of half of Europe, had the better claim to. Here we must turn fully to Elizabeth, because the relationship between these two queens is the great spine of Mary's adult life, and almost everything that befell her can be understood as a working out of the impossible problem the two of them posed to each other. Elizabeth was 9 years the elder, and where Mary was warm and impulsive and ruled by her heart, Elizabeth was cool and calculating and ruled, with iron discipline, by her head. Elizabeth had survived a childhood of mortal danger, had watched her own mother go to the block, had spent time imprisoned in the Tower under suspicion of treason, and had emerged from all of it with a wariness so deep that she would spend her entire reign refusing to commit herself fully to anything or anyone, including marriage. She trusted no one absolutely. She gave herself to no one, and she looked at her younger cousin in the north, beautiful and Catholic and reckless, and possessed of a claim to her own throne, and she saw, with perfect clarity, both a kinswoman and a threat. The cruelest part of it is that the two women were, in their way, drawn to each other. They exchanged letters of real feeling. They exchanged portraits and tokens. They spoke more than once of meeting, and plans for a meeting were laid and unlaid more than once, and each time something intervened to prevent it. I find it almost unbearably poignant, this near meeting that never happened, these two extraordinary women circling each other for decades across a border neither would cross, each the only true peer the other had, each unable to trust the other for a single moment. Elizabeth's central demand was that Mary should formally renounce her claim to the English throne and recognise Elizabeth as the lawful and undoubted Queen of England. Mary's central demand, in return, was that Elizabeth should name her as her heir, should acknowledge that, failing children of Elizabeth's own body, the crown of England would pass to the line of the Scottish Queen. Neither would yield. Elizabeth would not name an heir, because to name an heir was, she believed, to sign one's own death warrant by giving the ambitious a future to plot toward, and Mary would not renounce a claim that was, she was certain, her birthright, and so they remained locked year after year, in a deadlock that no amount of warm correspondence could break. Two queens who needed each other, and feared each other in exactly equal measure. It is worth setting the two of them side by side for a moment, the two queens, because their lives form one of the great paired studies in all of history. Two women born to rule in the same corner of the world at the same time, cousins, rivals, mirrors, and never once in the same room. They were alike in more than blood. Both were highly educated, formidably intelligent women in an age that expected women to be neither. Both came to their thrones young and surrounded by men who meant to use them. Both faced the relentless pressure to marry, to subordinate themselves to a husband, to become a vessel for an heir, and both understood that to marry was, for a queen regnant, to risk handing away the very power that made her a queen. And there the likeness ends and the instructive difference begins, for they answered that pressure in opposite ways, and the opposite answers shaped their opposite fates. Mary married, and married again, and married a third time, each time reaching for love or strength or security in another person, each time placing her trust and her crown in a man's hands, and each marriage carried her closer to ruin. Elizabeth never married at all. She held off every suitor, every parliament, every counsellor who urged her to wed, through 45 years on the throne, keeping her own counsel, giving herself to no one, ruling alone with an iron and lonely discipline that cost her, surely, a great deal in private warmth, but that preserved her power and her life. Mary ruled with her heart and lost everything. Elizabeth ruled with her head and kept everything, and died old in her bed, the most successful monarch of her age. I do not think the contrast is quite so simple as a moral, as though Mary's tragedy were merely the wages of feeling, and Elizabeth's triumph the reward of reason. For Elizabeth had advantages of country and counsel and circumstance that Mary never enjoyed, and Mary faced storms that would have wrecked a colder pilot too. But the difference is real, and it is poignant, and one cannot help but feel that each woman possessed exactly the quality the other lacked. Had they been able to meet, to talk, to pool their gifts and their understanding, what might the two of them not have done? They were the only two people in the world who could have truly understood each other, and the tragedy of their lives is that they spent 30 years circling, fearing, and finally destroying one another, when they might, in some kinder world, have been each other's closest ally and only friend. It was into this deadlock that the marriage question now intruded, and it was over the marriage question that Mary made the first of the catastrophic errors that would, step by fatal step, carry her toward the scaffold. For when she at last chose a husband, she chose against all counsel, against Elizabeth's wishes, against the warnings of her own ablest advisers, the one man whose choosing would bring down upon her almost everything that followed. His name was Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, and he is where the long unraveling begins. Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, was 19 years old when Mary fell for him, and on paper he was a shrewd choice, whatever the disaster he became in practice. He was, like Mary herself, a grandchild of that same Tudor princess who had been Henry VIII's sister, which meant that he too carried a claim to the English throne, and that a marriage between the two of them would unite their claims and produce an heir with the strongest title imaginable to the crowns of both kingdoms. He was tall, taller even than Mary, which mattered to a woman of her unusual height, and he was handsome in a soft, boyish way, graceful, well-mannered, accomplished at dancing and music and all the courtly arts. When he came north and presented himself, Mary, who was 22 and lonely and ruled by her affections, was swept off her feet with a speed that alarmed everyone around her. By the high summer of 1565 they were married in the chapel at Holyrood, and Mary in her infatuation made him king, granting him the crown matrimonial and styling him King Henry, sovereign alongside her. The marriage to Darnley split her kingdom before it had even soured between the two of them, for not everyone in Scotland was willing to accept it, and chief among the unwilling was her own half-brother, the Earl of Moray, who had been the steadiest pillar of her government, the able and ambitious half-brother on whom she had leaned since her return, would not stomach the Darnley match. He distrusted Darnley's family, feared the rise of a Catholic-leaning faction around the new king, and saw his own influence slipping away. And so, within weeks of the wedding, he rose in armed rebellion against the queen he had served. The revolt is remembered by the slightly comic name of the Chase-about Raid, because that is essentially what it was, a season of marching and counter-marching across the lowlands in the late summer of 1565, the Queen and her new husband at the head of their forces, chasing the rebel lords about the country without ever quite bringing them to battle. And in this, her first real military test as a ruling queen, Mary showed the steel that was in her. She did not hesitate or temporize. She put on a steel cap by some accounts and rode out at the head of her own army with pistols at her saddle, pursuing her rebellious brother with an energy and a resolve that took everyone by surprise, and she ran him out of the kingdom. Moray fled across the border into England, a defeated exile, and Mary had won decisively the first armed challenge to her rule. It was in retrospect the high water mark of her power, the moment when she looked most like a strong and successful sovereign mastering her over-mighty lords. But victories of that kind have a way of costing more than they earn, for in driving out Moray, she had removed the ablest and most experienced statesman in her service, the man whose cool head had steadied her government for 4 years, and she had bound herself more tightly to Darnley and to the faction around him, at the very moment when Darnley was beginning to reveal himself as the worthless creature he was. She had won the battle and weakened her own position in the winning, and within months, the marriage that had caused the whole quarrel would curdle into the hatred that produced the murder of Rizzio. The Chase-about Raid shows us a Mary we do not often see, the Queen in the saddle, decisive and victorious and formidable. It is worth holding on to that image, because it will not last, and because it reminds us that her tragedy was never simple weakness. She could act, and act boldly, and win. Her undoing lay not in any want of courage, but in the company she kept, and the men she chose to love. And it was a calamity, and it revealed itself as one almost at once. For beneath the handsome surface, Darnley was vain, weak, petulant, dissolute, and consumed by a sense of his own importance that bore no relation to his abilities. He drank. He kept low company in the taverns of Edinburgh. He neglected the business of government for which he was supposedly now jointly responsible, and above all, resented, with a sulking and dangerous intensity, that Mary, having made him king in name, would not surrender to him the actual substance of power. She had seen quickly what he was. She had married a husband and discovered a child, and a spiteful child at that, and she drew back from him, declining to grant him the full sovereign authority he craved, the crown matrimonial that would have made him king in his own right, and king even should she die. His resentment curdled, and it found a focus, as such resentments will, in the figure of the person closest to the Queen, a man whom Darnley came to believe had stolen the influence and the intimacy that should by rights have been his own. That man was David Rizzio, an Italian musician who had risen to become Mary's private secretary and her closest confidant. He was by all accounts ugly, clever, cultivated, and devoted to the Queen, and Mary relied upon him utterly, kept him constantly at her side, trusted him with her correspondence and her secrets. To Darnley, gnabbed by jealousy, and egged on by a faction of Protestant lords who had their own reasons to want the Queen frightened and weakened, Rizzio became the explanation for everything that had gone wrong, the foreign favourite who had poisoned his wife against him, and usurped his place. The lords, for their part, saw in Darnley's jealousy a tool they could use. They wanted to break Mary's growing confidence, to seize the initiative in government, and perhaps to force her hand on matters of religion and policy. And so a conspiracy was formed, with the king himself at its head, and what they planned was murder, and they planned to do it in front of her. We should understand why they did it, because the murder of Rizzio was not the crime of passion it can appear, the jealous husband striking down a rival, but a calculated piece of political theatre with several authors and several aims. Darnley's jealousy was real enough, and it was the lever the others used, but the men who crowded into that little supper room behind him had colder purposes of their own. They were Protestant lords, many of them friends of the exiled Moray, and they were alarmed by the direction the Queen's government seemed to be taking, by the influence of a Catholic foreigner at her side, by the fear that Mary meant to roll back the Reformation and rule without them. They wanted to break her confidence and seize the initiative, to make her a frightened figurehead in their hands, and they calculated shrewdly that to murder her trusted secretary in front of her, while she was heavily pregnant and helpless, would terrorize her into submission, and perhaps, if the shock brought on a miscarriage or worse, remove both the Queen and her unborn child in a single stroke, leaving the realm to be governed by a council of lords with the pliable Darnley as their puppet king. That is what the killing was truly for. It was an attempted coup dressed as a crime of honour, and the choice to do it before the Queen's eyes, in her own chamber, with a blade and a pistol, was deliberate, meant to imprint upon her forever the lesson that her crown could not protect either her or the people she loved. They miscalculated only in one thing. They underestimated her. They thought to break a frightened girl, and found instead a woman whose nerve, under the worst pressure imaginable, was harder than any of theirs, and within days she had turned their own chosen instrument, Darnley, against them, and shattered their conspiracy. But the design behind that dreadful evening is worth knowing, because it tells us what kind of world Mary was trying to rule, a world in which the great men around her would commit murder in her presence to bend her to their will, and would happily have seen her dead and her child with her if it served their purpose. After Rizzio, she could never again mistake the nature of the men she governed. She had seen exactly how far they would go. What happened on the evening of the 9th of March 1566 is one of the most appalling scenes in the long history of the Scottish crown, and I will tell it to you plainly but without dwelling, because it does not need embroidering to land. Mary was at supper in a small private chamber off her bedroom in the palace of Holyrood House, in the company of a few intimates, Rizzio among them. She was 6 months pregnant. The door opened and Darnley entered, and behind him came armed men, lords and their followers, crowding into the little room. Rizzio understood at once what was coming. He fled to the Queen and clung to her skirts, crying out for her protection, and Mary stood and tried to shield him with her own body. This woman 6 months gone with child, placing herself between her terrified secretary and the drawn blades of his killers. It was no use. They dragged him from her, struck him down at the doorway of the chamber, and stabbed him again and again, more than 50 wounds in all, while the Queen was held back at the point of a pistol pressed, by some accounts, against her swollen belly. They killed him almost on top of her, and the message of the killing, beyond the death of one Italian, was clear and was meant for Mary alone. See how easily we reach the people you love. See how little your crown protects them. See what we can do. She never forgot it, and she never forgave it. And from that night, something in her changed. The trusting young Queen who had tried to charm John Knox and govern by affection was gone. In her place stood a woman who had felt the cold of a blade through the body of a friend who died clutching at her for safety, and who understood now, finally and completely, that she was surrounded by men who would kill in front of her and would kill her too if it served them. Her response in the immediate aftermath was a masterpiece of nerve. Trapped, isolated, her husband revealed as a traitor and a murderer. She did not panic. She worked on Darnley. She played upon his weakness and his fear, for the lords who had used him were already discarding him, and she persuaded him, within hours, that his only safety lay with her. Together, in the dead of night, the estranged king and the wronged queen slipped out of Holyrood and rode hard through the dark to the fortress of Dunbar, and from there Mary rallied the loyal lords and returned to Edinburgh at the head of an army, and the conspiracy collapsed. She had saved herself and her unborn child by sheer force of will and quickness of mind, and she had done it while carrying that child through a night of terror and a headlong ride across open country. Whatever else may be said of Mary Stuart, no one who knows this night can ever call her weak. I want to stay a moment longer with that night and the days that followed it, because they show us the truest measure of Mary Stuart, and because what she did in the aftermath of Rizzio's murder is the single most impressive feat of nerve in her entire life. Consider her position in the hours after the killing. Her secretary lay dead in a spreading pool of blood at the door of her chamber. Her husband had revealed himself as a traitor who had brought armed men into her private rooms and stood by while they butchered her friend before her eyes. She was a prisoner in her own palace, surrounded by the conspirators, 6 months pregnant, with the lords who had done this now intending to keep her confined and powerless while they ruled in her name. A weaker spirit would have collapsed. Mary did the opposite. She thought. She saw at once that her one route to safety lay through her worthless husband, and she set to work on him with a cold brilliance that is almost frightening to contemplate. Darnley was already afraid, for the lords who had used him were beginning to discard him, and Mary played upon that fear with consummate skill, soothing him, forgiving him, persuading him that the conspirators meant to betray him, and that his only hope of safety lay in reconciliation with her. Through the long hours she worked on him, and she won, and in the dead of the second night the King and Queen of Scots crept down a back stair, through the servants' quarters, and out past the very graveyard where Rizzio's hastily buried body lay, and mounted horses that loyal men had waiting, and rode. They rode through the dark for 5 hours, more than 20 miles, hard, the pregnant queen in the saddle through the cold spring night, all the way to the fortress of Dunbar on the coast. Darnley, terrified of pursuit, urged the horses on cruelly, and is said to have told his wife, when she begged him to have a care for the child she carried, that they could always make another. She did not forget that, either. At Dunbar she did not rest and hide. Within days she had gathered loyal lords to her side, raised a force of thousands, and marched back on Edinburgh at the head of an army, and the conspiracy that had seemed to hold her in its fist simply fell apart before her. The murderers fled. She had turned the whole disaster around in less than a week, by sheer intelligence and force of will, and she had done it while carrying the child who would become king of two kingdoms, through a night of terror and a headlong ride that might well have killed a less determined woman or cost her the baby. When you hear Mary Stuart described, as she so often is, as a creature of passion and poor judgment, opened on by her heart, remember this. Remember the queen who watched her friend murdered, kept her head, turned her treacherous husband, escaped by night through a graveyard, raised an army, and won, all in the space of a few days, 6 months pregnant. The judgment failed her often, the courage never did. And the child she had carried through all of that came safely into the world 3 months later, in a tiny room high in the fortress on the Edinburgh Rock, on the 19th of June, 1566, after a long and dangerous labour. When the boy was born, Mary did a thing that tells us how completely the marriage had already failed, for she summoned Darnley to the chamber, and she held the infant up before him and before the assembled witnesses, and she said to him, "This is your son, and no other man's." And she swore it solemnly, and bade him look upon the child, because she knew, and meant everyone present to know that she knew, the rumours that were already circling, the whispers that questioned the boy's paternity, and dishonoured her. It was a public reckoning disguised as a presentation, a wronged queen using the birth of her son to nail her husband to the truth in front of witnesses. The marriage was over in everything but name, but the dynasty was founded, and the small boy in her arms, all unknowing, already carried in him the union of the crowns. 3 months later, on the 19th of June, 1566, in a small chamber in the great rock fortress of Edinburgh Castle, the Queen was delivered of a son. They named him James, and this child, born into the wreckage of his parents' marriage, surrounded already by murder and plot and the bitter politics of a divided kingdom, would grow up to achieve the very thing that had eluded everyone, the peaceful union of the two crowns. For this infant, in time, would become James VI of Scotland, and then, upon the death of the childless Elizabeth nearly 40 years later, James I of England, the first man to wear both crowns at once, the founder of the Stuart dynasty over a united Britain. Everything Mary lost, her son would gain. The throne of England that she claimed and never touched, he would inherit and hold. But all of that lay far in the future, unimaginable from the vantage of that summer of 1566, when the child's mother held him in a fortress in a frightened city, married to a man she now despised and feared, the ground already shifting toward the next catastrophe. Before the marriage rotted entirely into murder, there was one last bright moment, and it is worth setting down, because it shows Mary's queenship at its zenith even as the ground was opening beneath it. In December of 1566, 6 months after the birth of her son, she held the boy's baptism at Stirling Castle, and she made of it a spectacle the like of which Scotland had never seen. 3 days of feasting, and pageantry and fireworks paid for at ruinous expense. Ambassadors come from England and France and Savoy, to stand as godparents or to watch, the great hall blazing with light, banquets carried in to the sound of trumpets, and at the climax a display of fireworks and a mock assault on a fortress built for the purpose, the first entertainment of its kind ever staged in the kingdom. It was a deliberate act of statecraft, this magnificence. Mary meant to show the watching powers of Europe that the Scottish crown was secure, that her dynasty was founded, that here was an heir to 2 kingdoms and perhaps 3, baptized in splendour before the eyes of the world. And for those 3 glittering days she carried it off, presiding over the festivities as the very image of a successful queen, a mother with a healthy son, a sovereign at the height of her powers. But the splendour was a shell over a void, and everyone at Stirling knew it. Darnley, the child's father, the king, sulked in his quarters and would not attend his own son's baptism, so deep was the estrangement, so total the collapse of the marriage, and his absence was the loudest thing at the whole festival, a silence at the centre of all the noise that the ambassadors noted and reported home. Mary shone, and her husband would not come downstairs, and within 2 months he would be dead in a garden with the smell of gunpowder in the air. I find the Stirling baptism one of the most haunting episodes in her life, precisely because of this contrast, the brilliant surface and the rot beneath. The Queen blazing with confidence above an abyss she must surely have sensed, even if she could not yet see its shape. It is a very human thing to throw the grandest party of your life at the exact moment your world is falling apart, to insist on magnificence as everything quietly comes undone. She would never again preside over anything like it. The fireworks at Stirling were, in a sense, the last light of her reign, and they burned all the brighter for the dark that was closing in. Because the marriage to Darnley, having produced an heir, had nothing left to offer anyone. Mary loathed him now, and could barely bring herself to be in his presence. The lords loathed him for having betrayed them after they betrayed Rizzio with him, for he had turned on his fellow conspirators to save himself and was trusted by no one in the kingdom. He had made himself, in the space of a year, the single most hated and isolated man in Scotland, a king with no friends, no power, no purpose, sulking and drinking and plotting feebly in corners, a problem to which everyone wished there were a solution. And in the cold early months of 1567, a solution was found. It is the darkest passage of Mary's life, the one over which historians have argued for 4 centuries without ever reaching certainty, and we must walk through it carefully, because what we believe about it determines what we believe about her. His name, the man at the centre of what came next, was James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, and we must now bring him fully into the story, for he is the 3rd of the men who shaped Mary's destiny. After the boy King Francis she had pitied, and the boy King Darnley she had loved and lost, Bothwell was nothing like either of them. He was older, a hard and capable borders nobleman, a soldier, rough, ruthless, dangerous, the kind of forceful man who had been entirely absent from Mary's life of charming weaklings. He had been loyal to her mother and loyal to her, one of the few great lords who had never wavered, and in the chaos and fear that followed Rizzio's murder, Mary had come to lean upon his strength. Whether what grew between them was love, or the desperate gratitude of a frightened woman toward the one strong man who seemed to stand by her, or something darker and more coerced, is among the questions that can never now be answered. But Bothwell wanted Darnley gone, and so by this point did almost everyone. And in February of 1567, Darnley was gone, in a manner so violent and so strange that the scandal of it would ring across Europe and would, in the end, destroy his widow. In the months between the birth of his son and his own death, Darnley sank into a wretchedness that made him, if anything, more dangerous than before, for a desperate man with a claim to a crown and nothing left to lose is a problem that tends to resolve itself violently. He was shunned by everyone. Mary could barely endure his presence. The lords despised him as a traitor twice over, the man who had conspired with them to murder Rizzio and then betrayed them to save himself, and there was not a faction in Scotland that would trust him or take his part. He talked, in his bitterness, of leaving the kingdom, of schemes to seize power, of grievances real and imagined, and his loose and reckless tongue frightened those who heard it, for a discarded king who feels himself wronged is liable to say and do anything. He had made himself, in the space of barely a year, an intolerable presence at the heart of the state, a man whom everyone wished gone, and no one knew how to remove by any lawful means, and so the lords did what the lords of that violent age so often did. They came together, quietly, the great men of the kingdom, and they reached an understanding among themselves that Darnley must be dealt with, and they put their agreement, by some accounts, into a bond, a written compact among the conspirators to rid the realm of him by one means or another. How much Mary knew of this, whether she was party to it, whether she merely sensed which way the wind was blowing and looked the other way, or whether she knew nothing at all, is the very question that the casket letters were later produced to answer and that we examined and could not settle. What is certain is that by the opening weeks of 1567, a great many powerful people wanted Darnley dead, that arrangements were being made, and that the wretched young king, for all his cunning and his fear, was walking half aware toward a garden in Edinburgh where his life would end. The machinery of his destruction was assembled. All that remained was the night. Darnley had fallen ill, probably with syphilis, and had been brought to Edinburgh to recover, lodged in a house at a place called Kirk-o-Field, just within the old town walls, where Mary visited him and tended him with a solicitude that had returned, for whatever reason, in his sickness. On the night of the 9th of February, 1567, she left him to attend a wedding masque at Holyrood. In the small hours, the house at Kirk-o-Field was destroyed by a tremendous explosion, a great quantity of gunpowder having been packed beneath it. When the smoke cleared and the searchers came, they found the building reduced to rubble. But Darnley's body was not in the rubble. It was discovered in the garden some distance away, in a nightshirt, unmarked by the blast, and beside it the body of his servant. The King of Scots had not been killed by the explosion at all. He had been strangled or smothered in the garden while trying to flee the house before the powder went up. The explosion, it seemed, had been meant to hide a murder that had already happened, or had gone off too soon, or had never been quite the point. To this day no one can say exactly how Darnley died, or in what order events unfolded. What no one doubted, then or since, was that he had been murdered, and that powerful hands were behind it. Suspicion fell at once upon Bothwell, and with him, fatally, upon the Queen. Placards appeared in the streets of Edinburgh, naming Bothwell as the murderer. A trial was held, but it was a hollow thing, stage-managed and rushed, with Bothwell's armed men filling the city and no one daring to bring evidence against him, and he was acquitted to the disgust of the people. And then came the act that destroyed Mary in the eyes of the world, the act that no defence has ever quite been able to explain away. Within 3 months of her husband's murder, Mary married the man everyone believed had murdered him. We must handle this carefully, because it is the crux of the whole tragedy. The marriage to Bothwell was preceded by an episode that may have been an abduction and may have been a charade. As the Queen was riding back to Edinburgh, Bothwell intercepted her with a large body of men, took hold of her bridle, and carried her off to his castle at Dunbar, where he kept her for some days. Mary's defenders, then and now, have held that she was seized against her will and forced, in the oldest and ugliest sense, into submission and then into marriage, a captive with no choice left to her. Her enemies held that the abduction was play acting, arranged between the two of them to give a veil of necessity to a union they both desired. The truth is lost. What is certain is that Bothwell, recently and hastily divorced from his own wife, married the Queen of Scots in May of 1567 by Protestant rites, scarcely 3 months after the murder of her previous husband, and that, with this marriage, Mary signed away whatever sympathy and loyalty remained to her. The Catholic powers of Europe recoiled from a queen married in a heretic ceremony to a suspected murderer. Her own subjects rose against her in fury. The lords who had themselves, many of them, been complicit in Darnley's death now turned upon Bothwell and the Queen with the loud righteousness of men eager to bury their own guilt beneath someone else's. Whatever Mary had been, whatever she had hoped to be, she was now, in the judgment of nearly everyone, a woman who had conspired in the killing of her husband to marry his killer. The charge has never been proven. It has never been disproven. And it did not need to be either to bring her down. There is an image that the people of Mary's century would have reached for at this point in her story, and it is worth pausing on, because it shaped how they understood lives like hers, and because it fits her almost too well. They spoke of the wheel of fortune, a great turning wheel to which all human beings were bound, that carried them up to the heights of power and glory, and then, with the same indifferent motion, carried them down again to ruin and death, and the higher one rose upon it, the further one had to fall. Kings and queens were thought to ride that wheel more dramatically than ordinary folk, their elevation greater and their fall correspondingly more terrible, and the lesson drawn from their misfortunes was a sober one, that no earthly height is secure, that fortune gives nothing it does not eventually take back, that the crowned head sleeps no easier than the beggar, and often a great deal worse. I do not know that the image explains anything, but I find it hard not to think of it as we watch Mary's fortunes turn. Consider how high she had ridden. A queen in her cradle, a queen of France at 16, the most exalted young woman in Europe, with a claim to a third crown besides. And consider the descent, the swift and pitiless descent that we have now reached. Husband murdered, throne lost, army shattered, crown signed away on a prison island, every height she had occupied stripped from her one by one until she stood with nothing. The wheel had carried her as high as a human being could go, and was now carrying her all the way down, and it would not stop in her case until it reached the very bottom, the block at Fotheringhay 20 years on. The men and women who first told her story would have nodded grimly at the shape of it, recognizing the ancient pattern, the great brought low, the warning to all who climb. We are perhaps less certain than they were that the universe teaches such tidy lessons, but the shape is real, whatever it means, and there are few lives in all of history that trace the full arc of that turning wheel more completely than the life of Mary Stuart, from the summit to the dust. The end came with bewildering speed. A confederacy of lords raised an army against the Queen and her new husband, and in June of 1567, the two forces faced each other at a place called Carberry Hill, east of Edinburgh. There was no battle. Through the long hot day, Mary's support simply drained away, her men slipping off the field in ones and twos, unwilling to fight for Bothwell, until she stood almost alone. To spare further bloodshed, and perhaps to save him, she agreed to surrender herself on condition that Bothwell be allowed to ride free. It was the last she ever saw of him. He fled north and then overseas, and ended his days years later in a Danish prison, by some accounts driven mad in chains. Mary never set eyes on him again. She gave herself up to the Lords, and they brought her back to Edinburgh, and the homecoming was a nightmare. The common people, who had once been charmed by their young queen, now lined the streets and screamed abuse at her, called her murderess and worse, for the placards and the rumours had done their work, and the crowd believed her guilty. She was paraded through her own capital, dishevelled, exhausted, her clothing torn, a queen displayed to her people as a criminal. And then they took her away, north out of the city, to an island in the middle of a lonely loch, and there they shut her up. Spare a thought before we leave him forever, for what became of Bothwell, the third of her husbands and the agent of her ruin, because his end was as wretched as any in this story, and is almost never told. After they parted on the field at Carbery, the man for whom she had thrown away her kingdom fled north and then took ship, hoping perhaps to raise help abroad and return for her. He never returned. Driven by storms, he came at last to Norway, where, by a stroke of grim coincidence, he fell into the hands of relatives of a woman he had wronged and abandoned years before, and from there he was handed to the King of Denmark, who saw in the fugitive a useful pawn and had no intention of letting him go. And so Bothwell, the hard, ambitious, reckless Borders lord who had seized a queen and lost a crown, ended his days in a Danish prison, chained, by the accounts that reach us, in a dungeon for the better part of a decade, his mind giving way under the confinement until he died at last in 1578, mad and forgotten, in chains far from Scotland and far from the Queen whose fate his ambition had sealed. Mary never saw him again after Carbery, and never knew, perhaps, the full horror of his end. The two of them, who had been bound together in the most catastrophic union of her life, the marriage that destroyed her standing in the eyes of the world, were parted in that single afternoon, and spent the rest of their separate lives in separate prisons, hers gilded and his a true dungeon, both of them captives until death, both brought down by the same dark season of 1567. Whatever passed between them, whether love or calculation or coercion or some bitter mixture of all three, it ended in this two ruined lives in two distant cells, and a question that can never be answered about what either of them truly felt for the other. He is the most shadowy of her three husbands, and the most consequential, and he vanishes from her story on the field at Carbery into a darkness from which only the rumour of his dreadful end ever emerged. The island prison was Loch Leven, a small fortified house on a scrap of land in the centre of a wide cold loch, and Mary was held there through the second half of 1567, cut off from the world by water on every side. She was unwell, and she was pregnant again, this time with Bothwell's child, twins as it turned out, and in the misery of that Highland captivity she miscarried them. And it was while she lay weak and grieving, and utterly in their power, that the Lords came to her with the document that they had been determined to extract from the beginning. They forced her to abdicate. They placed before her papers renouncing the crown of Scotland in favour of her infant son, that small boy James, not yet 13 months old, and they made her sign. She signed under duress, surrounded by armed men, threatened, by some accounts, with death or worse if she refused, a queen of 24 putting her name to her own deposition by the light of a candle on a prison island. Her half-brother Moray was made regent to govern in the baby king's name, and the 13-month-old child was crowned in a Protestant ceremony with John Knox preaching the sermon as James VI of Scotland. Mary's reign was over. She had ruled in her own person for 6 years. She had a great deal of life still before her, and she would spend almost all of it in captivity. But not yet, because Mary Stuart was never a woman to accept defeat quietly, and even from that island she found a way. Over the months of her imprisonment she worked her charm, as she always did, upon the people around her, and she won the devotion of a young member of the family that held her, a boy named Willie Douglas, and through him she made her escape. On a May evening in 1568, the boy stole the keys during supper, locked the household in, and rowed the Queen across the dark water to the far shore, where loyal supporters were waiting with horses. She was free, and with astonishing speed she rallied an army, for there remained many in Scotland who held that she was still their lawful queen, unjustly deposed, and within days she had some 6,000 men under her banner. For one brief moment it seemed the wheel might turn again in her favour. It did not. Her forces met the Regent Moray's army at Langside near Glasgow on the 13th of May, 1568, and in the space of 3/4 of an hour they were utterly broken. Mary watched the rout from a hillside, watched her last army shatter and run, and in that moment every door in Scotland closed against her. She could not stay, she could not fight again. She had, by her own reckoning, 3 choices. She could remain in Scotland and fall into the hands of the lords who had imprisoned her once, and would not be so gentle a second time. She could flee to France, to the country that had raised her, where she still held lands and rank as the Dowager Queen. Or she could throw herself upon the mercy of England and her cousin Elizabeth, Queen to Queen, and trust that royal kinship and royal sympathy would see her restored to her throne. She chose England. It was the worst decision of her life, and she made it, against the urging of her closest companions, in the panic and exhaustion of defeat, and it sealed her fate. The escape from Lochleven deserves to be told for its own sake, because it is the last adventure of her free life, and it has all the romance that her captivity would so utterly lack. Through the long months on the island she had done what she always did. She had charmed the people who held her, and chief among her converts was a boy of the household, a young Douglas named Willie, who fell under the spell of the captive queen and resolved to free her. On a May evening in 1568, while the family was at supper, the boy contrived to steal the keys to the castle, slipped Mary out through a postern, opened the great gate behind them, and dropped the keys into the mouth of a cannon, or the lock itself, so that none could follow, and rowed her across the dark water to the far shore, where loyal horsemen waited. It was the stuff of ballad, and it worked, and for a few brief days Mary tasted freedom and hope again, riding through a countryside where many still held her their rightful queen, watching the loyal lords flock to her banner, until she had an army of some thousands at her back. The wheel, it seemed, was turning her way once more. It turned, and then it broke. On the 13th of May, her forces met the Regent Moray's smaller but better-led army at Langside, near Glasgow, and in less than an hour it was over. Mary watched from a nearby hill as her men were outmanoeuvred and broken and put to flight, watched her last army dissolve before her eyes, and in that moment she understood that Scotland was lost to her, perhaps forever. And then came the decision that sealed her fate, made in the panic and grief of defeat against the urgent counsel of those around her. She would not stay in Scotland to be retaken. She would not, despite every argument, sail for France, where she had rank and lands and safety and friends. She fixed instead upon England, Upon throwing herself on the mercy of her cousin Elizabeth, queen to queen, certain that royal kinship and womanly sympathy would move the English queen to receive her, restore her, and lend her an army. Her companions begged her to choose France. She would not hear them. Some deep instinct, or some deep miscalculation, told her that her future lay south with Elizabeth, and she rowed hard for the Solway shore to cross into England and into the trap that would hold her till she died. It was the worst decision of a life that had not been short of bad decisions, and the saddest part is that she made it freely, in hope, walking toward the one door in all the world that should have stayed shut to her. She rowed hard for the southwest coast, and on the 16th of May, 1568, she crossed the Solway Firth in a humble fishing boat, the deposed Queen of Scots huddled among the nets, and landed on the English shore near a place called Workington in Cumberland. She had with her a handful of loyal attendants and the clothes she stood in. She believed she had come to a refuge, to a cousin who would receive her with open arms, and lend her an army to recover her crown. What she had in fact done was deliver herself, of her own free will, into the keeping of the one person on earth for whom her very existence was an insurmountable problem. She had walked into the trap, and the trap, though neither queen yet understood quite how completely, would not let her go for 19 years. She did not understand at first that she had become a prisoner. That is one of the quietly terrible things about the beginning of her captivity, the slowness with which the truth of it closed around her. When she landed in England, she believed herself a royal guest, a queen come to seek the aid of a fellow queen, and she expected to be received at Elizabeth's court within days, embraced as a cousin, lent an army, and sent home in triumph. Instead, she was lodged, courteously enough, in a castle in the north, and asked to wait, and the waiting stretched from days into weeks, and the weeks into months, and the courtesy remained, but the doors did not open, and slowly, by degrees, she came to perceive that the guest had become a prisoner, and that the prison, however gilded, was not going to release her. There was no single moment of arrest, no clang of a cell door, only the gradual dawning that she could not leave, that her letters were watched, that her requests to see Elizabeth were always deferred, that she had walked of her own free will into a confinement from which there was no agreed way out. Bad? It must have been a peculiar agony, that slow realization, worse in its way than an honest imprisonment, for she was never told she was condemned, and so could never quite abandon hope, never given a sentence with an end, and so could never count down the days to freedom. She was simply held indefinitely in a limbo that had no name and no term, a queen who was not charged with any crime and not free to go, suspended in a question that Elizabeth could not answer and would not resolve. And she went on hoping, through all of it, through the years and then the decades, hoping that the next letter would move her cousin, that the next embassy would secure her release, that some turn of events would open the doors at last. And the hope which sustained her was also part of the cruelty, because it was never quite extinguished and never once fulfilled. The trap had closed so gently that she scarcely heard it close. By the time she understood that it would hold her until she died, she had already been inside it for years. Elizabeth's dilemma, when the fugitive landed on her shore, was as complete as any a monarch ever faced, and it is worth understanding fully, because Mary's whole long captivity flowed from it. To receive Mary warmly, to lend her an army, and restore her to the Scottish throne, would mean making war upon the Protestant lords now governing Scotland in friendship with England, and setting a dangerous example that a people might depose their anointed sovereign and answer for it. To send her back to Scotland would be to send her to her death, for the Lords would never suffer her to live free. To let her go on to France would be to hand a weapon to England's enemies, for the French might use her, restore her, and turn Scotland once more into a hostile Catholic power on England's northern flank. And to keep her, simply to keep her, was to hold within the kingdom a Catholic claimant to Elizabeth's own throne, a living banner around which every disaffected Catholic in England might one day gather. There was no good answer. There was only the choice of which danger to live with. And Elizabeth chose, as she so often did, to do nothing decisive, to keep Mary in a kind of suspended custody, neither guest nor prisoner, neither restored nor condemned, while the lawyers and the counsellors argued and the years slipped by. To give that custody a veneer of justice, an inquiry was convened, first at York and then at Westminster, late in 1568, to examine the conduct of the Scottish Queen, in particular her possible part in the murder of Darnley. It was here that the most notorious pieces of evidence in the entire affair were produced, the documents that have come down to us as the casket letters. These were a set of letters and sonnets, said to have been found in a silver casket belonging to Bothwell, and said to be in Mary's hand, and said to prove beyond doubt that she had known of, and consented to her husband's murder, and had carried on a passionate adulterous correspondence with Bothwell before Darnley was dead. If genuine, they damned her utterly. If forged, they were a monstrous slander. And to this day no one can say with certainty which they were, because the originals vanished within a generation, and only copies and translations survive, copies that show every sign of having been, at the very least, tampered with, edited, perhaps stitched together from genuine fragments and outright fabrications both. Modern scholarship leans on the whole toward the view that they were at least partly forged, doctored by Mary's enemies to make a case that the truth alone would not support. But certainty is impossible, and the impossibility is itself part of the tragedy. The inquiry in any case was never meant to reach a verdict, and it did not. Elizabeth had no wish to find her cousin guilty, for to do so would force her to act, and she had no wish to find her innocent, for to do so would oblige her to set Mary free. So the proceedings were allowed to dissolve without conclusion, the casket letters neither proven nor dismissed, the charge left hanging in the air where it would hang forever, a permanent shadow over Mary's name that could be invoked whenever it was useful and ignored whenever it was not. Mary herself was never permitted to appear before the inquiry, never allowed to see the evidence against her, never given the chance to defend herself face to face, a denial of natural justice that she protested with the full force of her royal indignation, and that availed her nothing at all. The machinery of her long imprisonment was now in motion, dressed in the forms of law, and there was no longer any way out of it. She had become, in the cold phrase the situation invited, a problem to be managed rather than a queen to be served. To Dactard's deed, we should pause here, with the inquiry dissolved and nothing proven, to sit honestly with the question that hangs over this entire life, and that we are never going to be able to answer, because the honest acknowledgement of what we cannot know is part of telling the story truthfully. Was she guilty? Did Mary Stuart know that her husband Darnley was to be murdered, and consent to it, and conspire with Bothwell to bring it about so that she might marry him? 4 centuries of historians have given 4 centuries of answers, and the answers have swung back and forth with the fashions of each age, and the plain truth is that nobody knows, and nobody now ever will. The evidence that survives is almost all tainted. The casket letters, which would settle the matter if they could be trusted, cannot be trusted, for the originals are gone and the copies bear the fingerprints of her enemies. The confessions were extracted under pressure. The chronicles were written by partisans, by men who hated her or men who served her, and there is scarcely a neutral word about her to be found in any contemporary source. We are left with a fog as thick as the one that met her ship at Leith, and somewhere inside it the truth of what she did or did not know, lost beyond recovery. And I have come to think, telling this story, that the uncertainty is not a flaw in the tale, but very nearly its point. Mary Stuart has fascinated the world for 400 years precisely because she cannot be resolved, because she will not sit still in either the box marked innocent or the box marked guilty. To her devoted defenders, she is a wronged and beautiful queen, victim of ruthless men and a jealous cousin, a Catholic martyr betrayed and judicially murdered. To her detractors, she is a vain and reckless woman who married her husband's killer and brought her ruin upon herself by her own folly and passion. Both pictures can be drawn from the same facts. Both have been drawn, again and again, by serious people. The likeliest truth, I suspect, lies in neither extreme but in the difficult human middle, where most truths live. A woman neither saint nor monster, capable of great courage and great misjudgment both, who may well have known more than was good for her about the death of a husband she had every reason to hate, and who paid for the ambiguity of it with 19 years of imprisonment and her head. But I hold even that loosely, because the fog is real, and anyone who tells you they know for certain what was in Mary Stuart's heart in the winter of 1567 is telling you more than the evidence can bear. We can follow what she did. We cannot finally see what she meant, and perhaps it is fitting that a woman so endlessly watched, so spied upon and copied and reported and judged, should keep, at the very centre of herself, one room into which no one has ever been able to see. And so begins the longest chapter of her life, far longer than her reign, far longer than her childhood, the 19 years of captivity in England that would carry her from a woman of 25 to a woman of 44, and would end only on the scaffold. I want to slow down here and dwell with her in this captivity, because it is the part of her story that the dramatic legend tends to skip over, hurrying from the flight into England straight to the execution, as though the 2 decades between were merely an interval. They were not an interval. They were the greater part of her adult life, and they had a texture and a daily reality of their own that tells us more about the woman she was than all the murders and battles put together. Let your mind settle into these years with me. They moved slowly, and we will move slowly through them. She was not kept in a dungeon. That is the first thing to understand, and it matters. Mary was a queen, and even in captivity she was treated, for the most part, as one. She was held in a succession of houses and castles across the English Midlands and the north, Tutbury and Sheffield and Wingfield and Chatsworth and others, grand establishments where she kept a household of her own, sometimes numbering dozens of attendants, with her own cooks and grooms and ladies and secretaries, her own cloth of state, the canopy embroidered with her royal arms beneath which she sat to remind all who entered that she remained an anointed sovereign. She had her own furniture carried from house to house, her beds and hangings, her chairs and her religious objects. She dined off silver. She was allowed, within limits that tightened as the years passed, to ride out and to hawk, and to take the waters at Buxton for her health. By the standards of imprisonment, it was a gilded confinement indeed, and Mary clung fiercely to every outward sign of the royalty that no captivity could take from her, for it was all, in the end, that she had left. but it was captivity all the same, and the gilding could not disguise the iron beneath. She could not leave. She could not go where she wished. Every letter she wrote and received was, increasingly, watched and copied and read by others. Every new face admitted to her household was a possible spy, and many of them were. She was moved from house to house at the will of her keepers, often to colder and meaner lodgings when the authorities wished to punish or pressure her, and the worst of these, the place she came to dread, was Tutbury, a decayed and draughty old castle on a hill, damp, ill-drained, evil-smelling, where the wind came through the walls and the marsh below sent up its fogs, and her health, never robust after the ordeals of her youth, broke down in earnest. For Mary's body was failing her through these years, even as her spirit held firm. She suffered terribly from rheumatism and from recurring pains in her side, from swellings in her limbs that left her, in her later captivity, scarcely able to walk, so that she had to be carried. The tall, athletic young woman who had ridden through the Scottish night and hunted across the French countryside became, by slow degrees, a stooped and ailing invalid, prematurely aged grey before her time, her famous beauty worn away by illness and confinement and grief. The portraits of her later years show a heavy, tired, careworn face, and it is hard to find in it the dazzling girl who had married a king at Notre Dame. The years took her, as the years take everyone, but they took her in a cage. The houses themselves became the landscape of her life, and each had its own character, and she came to know them as a prisoner knows the few places allowed to her, with an intimacy born of having nowhere else to look. She was moved among them over the years, sometimes for her health, sometimes for greater security when a plot was feared, sometimes simply because the enormous household of a captive queen had eaten a place bare and exhausted its drains and its welcome. There was Tutbury, the one she dreaded, an old decaying castle on a windy hill in Staffordshire, damp and draughty and ill-built, sitting above marshland that sent up foul air, where the cold came through the walls and the smell of the place never left, and her health broke down most severely. She hated Tutbury, and said so, and her keepers used it deliberately in the later years, moving her there to punish and to pressure her, knowing how the misery of the place wore upon her. There was Sheffield, where she spent the longest stretch of all, more than a decade, in the great castle and the manor lodge that belonged to her keeper, the Earl of Shrewsbury. There was Chatsworth, the grand house in the Derbyshire hills that Bess of Hardwicke had built, where the confinement was gentler and the surroundings handsome. There was Wingfield, and there were others, a whole slow circuit of the great houses of the English Midlands and the North, and through them all Mary carried her household and her royal trappings, her cloth of state and her beds and her hangings, setting up in each new place the same shrunken court, the same canopy embroidered with her arms, the same insistence that she remained a queen wherever they chose to keep her. And there was Buxton, which was not a prison but a relief from prison, the medicinal spa where she was permitted in some years to go and take the waters for her aching joints, and these visits were the great treats of her captivity, brief tastes of something like normal life, where she might meet people from the wider world and walk a little and feel, for a few weeks, less like a prisoner and more like an invalid lady taking a cure. I find it strange and affecting to think of her in these places, all of them still standing in part, some of them visited by thousands every year who walk through rooms where the captive Queen of Scots once sat at her embroidery and never knew it. The grandeur of the houses only sharpens the sadness of it, for they were beautiful, many of them, and she could not leave them. and beauty you cannot leave becomes a kind of mockery. A garden you may walk in only under guard is not freedom. It is the shape of freedom drawn around a cage. She lived 19 years inside that shape, moving from one handsome prison to another, growing old and ill and grey within walls that were, by any ordinary measure, the walls of luxury, and never once, in all those years, able to walk out of a door and go where she pleased. We tend to imagine imprisonment as dungeons and chains. Hers was tapestries and silver and a canopy of state, and it was imprisonment all the same. And perhaps the gentler, the gilding, the crueler, the lesson it taught, that no comfort in the world can make up for the loss of the open road and the right to choose your own direction. For most of those 19 years she was kept in the charge of one man, and his name was George Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, one of the richest noblemen in England, and the burden of guarding her nearly ruined him. It is one of the quietly human threads of the whole story, the relationship between the captive queen and her long-suffering keeper, who was caught in an impossible position from the day Elizabeth handed Mary to him. He was responsible for her security with his life, answerable for her every movement to a suspicious government in London, and he was expected, into the bargain, to meet much of the enormous expense of maintaining a royal prisoner and her household out of his own pocket, a cost that drained his fortune year after year, and that the Crown reimbursed late, grudgingly, or not at all. He could not relax his guard, for to lose her would be treason, and he could not treat her harshly, for she was a queen and his sovereign's cousin, and he was caught forever between the two demands. Over the years a strange, wary, almost domestic familiarity grew up between captor and captive, the two of them bound together by the sheer length of their forced companionship, and London watched it with growing unease, suspicious that the Earl had grown too fond of his prisoner, too soft, too easily charmed by the famous Stuart charm that had undone so many before him. That suspicion was sharpened by the presence in the household of the Earl's formidable wife, and here we meet the third of the women I asked you to hold in mind at the start. Her name was Elizabeth, called Bess, of Hardwicke, and she was one of the most remarkable Englishwomen of the entire century, a self-made dynast who had risen from modest gentry beginnings through 4 well-judged marriages to become, by the end of her life, the wealthiest woman in England after the Queen herself, the builder of great houses, the founder of a line of dukes. Bess of Hardwicke was clever, hard, acquisitive, indomitable, everything Mary was not, and for a number of years the two women were thrown together in the strange intimacy of the prison household, and for a time they were companions. They sat together over their needlework through the long confined evenings, the captive queen and the formidable countess, and from those hours of shared sewing there survives one of the most touching and revealing relics of Mary's whole imprisonment. For Mary, denied almost every other occupation, poured herself into embroidery. It became her solace, her language, her quiet rebellion, the one art left to a queen with empty hands and empty hours. Working alongside Bess, she produced over the years a vast quantity of exquisite needlework, panels and hangings stitched with extraordinary skill, and into them she sewed again and again small coded messages, emblems and mottos and devices that spoke, to those who could read them, of her captivity and her hopes and her grievances. There is one famous panel showing a hand reaching down from the heavens with a pruning knife, cutting away a barren branch from a fruitful vine, and beneath it a motto in Latin that means, roughly, "flourishes by wound." It is generally understood to be a veiled image of Elizabeth as the hand cutting away Mary, the barren queen striking down the fertile one. The prisoner who had a son speaking silently of the cousin who had none. Imagine the patience of it. Imagine the long hours, the failing light, the needle going in and out through the cloth, a deposed queen with nothing left to her but thread and time, encoding her defiance into objects so beautiful that her enemies would hang them on their walls without ever guessing what they said. There is no more poignant image in this whole life than Mary at her embroidery, stitching her soul into silk because every other avenue of expression had been closed to her. She kept dogs too, little lap dogs that she loved with the fierce attachment of a woman who has lost almost everything else to love, and they were her companions through the empty years, curled in her lap as she sewed, following her from room to room in the houses where she was held. She kept caged birds. She wrote letters without number, to Elizabeth, to the French court, to her relations and supporters across Europe, to the Pope, to anyone who might help her. Long, eloquent, by turns proud and pleading letters in her elegant French hand, sent out into the world like the messages I spoke of at the beginning of our evening, words cast toward distant strangers in the hope that they might land somewhere that could change her fate. Most of them changed nothing. Most of them, in the later years, were read first by her enemies. But she never stopped writing them, because to stop would have been to accept that she was forgotten and that she could not do. She was in her own unshakable estimation a queen still, unjustly held, and one day, surely, deliverance would come. And that conviction, that fixed and unyielding belief in her own royal right, was both the thing that sustained her through 19 years of confinement and the thing that in the end killed her. For Mary in captivity was not merely a sad and ailing prisoner stitching emblems by candlelight. She was, whether she fully chose it or not, the living centre of every Catholic hope in England and beyond. To the substantial number of English men and women who still held to the old faith in secret, who chafed under the Protestant settlement and prayed for its overthrow, Mary Stuart was not a deposed foreign queen languishing in honourable custody. She was the rightful Queen of England, divinely appointed, wrongfully kept from her throne by the heretic usurper Elizabeth, and her deliverance was a sacred cause. To the Catholic powers of Europe, to Spain and to the papacy, she was the key that might one day unlock England and return it to the true church. And so, year after year, plots formed around her, schemes to free her, to raise her, to set her on Elizabeth's throne, some of them serious and well-financed, some of them the fantasies of hot-headed young men, all of them deadly, because every one of them gave Elizabeth's government another reason to wish the prisoner dead. The plots began early and never stopped. Within little more than a year of Mary's arrival in England, the great Catholic earls of the north rose in rebellion, the Rising of the North, in 1569, an attempt to free the Scottish Queen, marry her to an English duke, and restore the old religion. It was crushed brutally, hundreds of the rebels hanged in their own villages as a warning, and Mary, who had been hurriedly moved further south out of the rebels' reach, was left more closely guarded than before. Then came the Ridolfi plot in 1571, a more dangerous conspiracy involving a Florentine banker, the Spanish, the Pope, and a scheme to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne with Spanish military help, which was uncovered and which sent the same English Duke, Norfolk, to the block for his part in it. Then the Throckmorton plot, a decade later, another design for a Catholic invasion, and a rising in Mary's name, again discovered, again ending in executions. Through all of these, Mary's own degree of involvement was murky, sometimes clearly knowing, sometimes only the passive object of other men's schemes. But the distinction mattered less and less as the years went on. The pattern was unmistakable. and it pointed in one direction. As long as Mary lived, she would be the magnet for conspiracy. As long as she lived, Elizabeth's life and throne would be in danger. And the men around Elizabeth, the hard, clever, ruthless servants of the Protestant state, were beginning to conclude that the problem of Mary Stuart admitted, finally, of only one permanent solution. Let me take you, before we move toward the end, into the texture of an ordinary day in that long imprisonment, because 19 years is an abstraction until you slow it down to the scale of a single morning, and it is in the single mornings, repeated some 7,000 times, that the real weight of her captivity lay. Imagine waking in a curtained bed in a cold room in an unfamiliar house, in the grey light of an English winter dawn, to the sound of rain against leaded glass, and the distant noise of a household that is not your own and yet exists entirely to keep you. Her women would come to dress her, the faithful few, and the dressing itself was slow and difficult in her later years, for her hands were stiff with rheumatism, and her swollen legs would barely bear her, and what had once been the quick adornment of a beautiful young queen had become the careful, painful tending of an invalid. There would be prayers, said quietly, for she clung to her forbidden faith, and her devotion structured the empty hours. There would be a little food. And then the day stretched out before her, hour upon hour upon hour, with nothing in it that she had chosen, and nowhere in it that she could go. She filled those hours as best she could, and the filling of them is its own quiet heroism. There was the embroidery, of course, the great labour of her captive years, the needle going in and out through the cloth by the window where the light was best, the slow accumulation of beauty out of boredom. There was reading, the lives of the saints and works of devotion, and whatever else her keepers permitted. There was the writing of letters, endless letters, her one thread to the world beyond the walls, though she came to know that every word she wrote was read by others before it reached the person she meant it for, that there were her little dogs, and her caged birds, and a small menagerie of pets that gave her something to love and care for when so much else had been taken away. On the better days, when her health and her keepers allowed, she might ride out a little way, or sit in a garden, or be carried to the medicinal springs at Buxton to take the waters for her aching joints. And these small excursions were the great events of her shrunken life, looked forward to for weeks and remembered for weeks after. And always, underneath everything, there was the waiting, the terrible open-ended waiting of a person whose life has been suspended, who cannot move forward because she is a prisoner, and cannot move back because the past is gone, who can only sit and sew and pray and write and wait for a deliverance that the years made steadily less likely, and that she never, to the very end, stopped believing would come. It is a particular kind of suffering, this, and it is worth naming because it is so different from the dramatic disasters of her youth. The murders and the battles and the headlong rides through the night were terrible, but they were swift, and they called upon a courage that Mary possessed in abundance, the courage of action, or the crisis met head-on. The captivity asked for a different and rarer kind of courage, the courage of endurance, of getting through one grey, unremarkable day after another with the spirit unbroken, of remaining, year after empty year, a queen in her own estimation, when every external sign of her queenship was being slowly stripped away. And by that harder measure, Mary's captivity is perhaps the most impressive part of her whole life. She did not go mad, as a weaker spirit might have. She did not collapse into despair. She held on, with her embroidery and her letters, and her faith, and her unshakable belief in her own royal right. and she came out the far end of 19 years of it still recognisably herself, still proud, still defiant, still capable of meeting her judges and her executioner with a composure that shamed them. The cage diminished her body, but it never broke her, and there is a kind of triumph in that which the axe could not undo. There was one grief, though, that ran through all those years, and that no embroidery could ease, and it is the saddest thread in the whole long story, sadder even than the scaffold, and we must speak of it now. Mary had a son. The infant James, born in the fortress of Edinburgh in the bright early summer of her reign, had been taken from her when he was 10 months old, in the wreck of her abdication, and she never saw him again. Let that sit for a moment. She was a mother who lost her child not to death but to politics, who knew that her son was alive and growing up not many days' ride to the north, and who was never permitted to hold him, or speak to him, or look upon his face, from the time he was a baby until the day she died, when he was a grown man of 20. Across all 19 years of her captivity, the King of Scotland and the captive Queen of Scots, mother and son, lived as strangers, parted by the very men who had deposed her, and who raised the boy to fill the throne they had taken from her. And the cruellest part of it is what those men made of the child. James was brought up by Mary's enemies, by the Protestant lords and the stern tutors they appointed, and he was raised deliberately and from infancy to regard his mother as a wicked woman, an adulteress, a murderess, a danger to the realm and to his own crown. Everything he was taught about her came from the people who had destroyed her. He grew up in the harsh, learned, Calvinist atmosphere of a Scotland that had rejected everything she stood for, and he became by every measure the opposite of his mother. Cautious where she was bold, calculating where she was warm, deeply and unshakably Protestant where she had died for the old faith. She wrote to him when she was at last permitted to, long letters full of a mother's love and a mother's longing, reaching across the years and the miles toward the child she had lost, proposing that they might rule Scotland together, that he might acknowledge her, that something of their bond might be recovered. He answered coldly, when he answered at all. He had no memory of her. She was to him a problem and an embarrassment, a deposed and disgraced figure who threatened the legitimacy of his own kingship, and he kept her at arm's length to the end. Worst of all, when the time came, he did almost nothing to save her. As his mother lay under sentence of death at Fotheringhay, James, the King of Scots, made only the most token of protests to Elizabeth, formal letters of objection that everyone, including James himself, understood to be hollow, for James had something to lose, and he was not a man to lose it for sentiment. He was Elizabeth's most likely heir. The childless Queen of England would, in the natural course of things, be succeeded by her nearest Protestant kinsman, and that kinsman was James. To quarrel seriously with Elizabeth over his mother, to threaten or to break with her, would be to risk the glittering prize of the English crown that he had wanted all his life. And so he weighed his mother's life against his own ambition, and his ambition won, and he let her die with a few cold, formal words of protest that fooled no one and were meant to fool no one. It is hard to judge him too harshly, perhaps. He had never known her, had been raised to despise her, and was playing for the highest stakes in Europe. But it is a bleak thing all the same that the one person who might have moved to save the captive queen, her own son, her only child, the boy she had carried through the night of Rizzio's murder and born in the fortress on the rock, chose his future over her life. She knew it too at the end. Among her last letters there is no bitterness toward him, only a mother's blessing sent to a son who had given her nothing in return, and that absence of reproach in the circumstances is its own kind of heartbreak. And what of Scotland, the kingdom she had fled in all the long years of her captivity? It is worth a glance, because her cause there did not die with her flight, but lingered and bled for years, and its slow extinction is part of the completeness of her loss. For a time after Langside, Scotland was riven by civil war between two parties, the King's men, who held for the infant James and the Regency, and the Queen's men, who held that Mary was still their lawful sovereign, unjustly deposed, and ought to be restored. The conflict was bitter and protracted. Her half-brother Moray, who had made himself regent, was assassinated in 1570, shot down in the street, the first man in recorded history to be killed by a firearm in a political assassination, and his death threw the country into fresh turmoil. Regent followed regent, several of them dying violently in their turn, and through it all the great fortress of Edinburgh Castle was held for the absent Queen by a loyal captain who refused to yield it, a last banner of her cause flying above the capital. It could not last. With English help, the castle was finally battered into surrender in 1573, and its defenders were hanged, and with that the Queen's party in Scotland was effectively finished. Her son grew toward manhood in the keeping of her enemies, the King's cause triumphant, and the hope of her restoration faded year by year until it was gone entirely. By the time of her trial and death, there was no longer any party in Scotland working seriously for her return. The kingdom had settled, under James, into the Protestant and English-leaning course that Mary had been unable to prevent, and her own people had in effect moved on and left her behind. She was not only a prisoner in England, she was by the end a sovereign without a kingdom even in theory, deposed beyond recall, her cause dead in the land of her birth, her son a stranger ruling in her place. The loss was total, and it had happened slowly, while she sat at her embroidery in the English Midlands, watching from a great distance as the country she had been born to rule forgot her and reshaped itself into something she would not have recognised, the long defeat completing itself far away, beyond her reach, while she waited for a restoration that the world had already decided would never come. It is worth understanding more fully what Mary had become to the Catholics of England and Europe during these years, because it was this, far more than anything she actually did, that condemned her in the end. To the English government she was a perpetual menace, and not without reason, for around her, whether she willed it or not, gathered every hope of those who longed to overthrow the Protestant settlement and return England to Rome. The first and most dangerous of the men drawn into her orbit was the Duke of Norfolk, the premier nobleman of England, who was tempted into a scheme to marry the captive Queen, and was drawn, through that ambition, into the web of the Ridolfi plot, a grand design involving the Pope and the King of Spain, for a foreign invasion, a Catholic rising, the murder of Elizabeth, and the placing of Mary on the English throne. The plot was uncovered, and Norfolk paid for it with his head, the first great victim of the long shadow Mary cast, and his death taught the English court a lesson it never forgot, that proximity to the Queen of Scots was lethal, and that as long as she lived she would draw ambitious men to their destruction, and endanger Elizabeth with every breath she took. Behind the throne, watching all of this with a cold and tireless vigilance, stood the man who would prove Mary's most relentless enemy, William Cecil, Lord Burghley, Elizabeth's chief minister for the whole of her reign. Burghley was everything the romantic legend of Mary is not: patient, methodical, unglamorous, utterly devoted to the survival of Protestant England and of the Queen he served, and he concluded, early and without sentiment, that there could be no lasting security for either while Mary Stuart drew breath. For decades he worked toward her removal, gathering evidence, encouraging the laws that would make her execution possible, pressing Elizabeth past her reluctance, the steady architect of the legal machinery that would one day close upon the Scottish Queen at Fotheringhay. Mary, for all her courage, never grasped the nature of the forces arrayed against her. She thought in terms of persons, of appeals to kinship and royalty and womanly feeling, of charm and reproach and the bonds between cousins. Burghley thought in terms of the state, of threats to be neutralized and dangers to be removed, and he was, in that contest, immeasurably the stronger, because the future belonged to his way of thinking and not to hers. She was the last great representative of an older idea of monarchy, sacred and personal. He was the servant of the modern state, cold and impersonal and patient, and the modern state would grind her down. Something happened to Mary, inwardly, over the slow accumulation of those captive years, and it is important to understand it, because it shaped how she met her end. In her youth, she had fought to keep her crown by every worldly means available to her, by marriage and alliance and rebellion and flight. But as decade gave way to decade and no deliverance came, as her body failed and her hopes thinned, she began by degrees to reframe her suffering in a different light. She had always been devout. Now her devotion deepened into something else, into a settled conviction that she was suffering not merely as a wronged queen, but as a persecuted Catholic, a defender of the true faith held captive by heretics, and that if she could not be delivered, then she might at least be a witness, a martyr, whose death would speak louder than her life had been allowed to. This turn in her thinking gave her a strange serenity in her final years, a composure that her keepers noted and her enemies underestimated. A woman who has decided that her death will mean something is a woman who can no longer be frightened by death, and the men who were closing in on her did not, until the very end, grasp that they were dealing with someone who had quietly made her peace with the scaffold and intended to mount it, if it came to that, as a kind of victory. Hold this in your mind as we move toward the close. The Mary of the final act is not the impulsive girl of the Scottish years. She is something harder and clearer and, in her own terms, almost unassailable. The man who finally caught her was Sir Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's principal secretary, and the architect of one of the first true intelligence services in European history. Walsingham was a Protestant of the most unbending kind, a man who had seen the slaughter of Protestants in France with his own eyes, and who regarded Mary Stuart not as a tragic prisoner, but as a mortal danger to his queen, his religion, and his nation, a danger that had to be removed. He had built, over years, a web of spies and informers, and intercepted correspondence that reached across England and far into the courts of Europe, and he had concluded that the half measures of mere imprisonment would never end the threat that Mary posed. Plots would keep forming around her as long as she breathed. What was needed was not another foiled conspiracy, but a conspiracy in which Mary herself could be caught, provably in her own hand, consenting to the murder of Elizabeth, for only then could the law be brought to bear upon a sovereign queen, and only then could Elizabeth, who shrank from shedding royal blood, be compelled to act. Walsingham did not merely wait for such a plot. He helped one along. The trap he laid was patient and merciless, and its workings are worth understanding, because Mary walked into it with her eyes open, and her own pen condemned her. By the mid-1580s, Mary's captivity had been tightened severely. She had been placed in the charge of a strict Puritan keeper, cut off from her usual channels of communication, denied the steady flow of letters that had been her lifeline to the wider world. And then, as if by providence, a secret means of correspondence seemed to open up. A young Catholic gentleman arranged a covert channel by which Mary's letters could be smuggled in and out of her prison, hidden in the bung of a beer barrel delivered to the household, sealed in waterproof packets, passing undetected, as she believed, beneath the noses of her guards. Mary seized upon it with joy and relief. At last she could write freely again, could plot and hope and conspire, as she had not been able to for years. What she did not know was that the entire channel was Walsingham's creation. The brewer was in his pay. Every letter that went into that beer barrel, and every letter that came out of it, passed first across the desk of Walsingham's master forger and codebreaker, a man named Philippes, who opened the packets, deciphered the codes, copied the contents, resealed them, and sent them on their way. Mary was writing her secret thoughts directly into the hands of the man who meant to destroy her, and she had no idea. The plot that sprang the trap is named for a young man called Anthony Babington, a wealthy and idealistic and dangerously naive Catholic gentleman who, in the summer of 1586, became the figurehead of a conspiracy to assassinate Elizabeth, free Mary, and raise a Catholic rising backed by a foreign invasion. Babington wrote to Mary through the beer barrel channel, laying out the whole design in detail, including, fatally, the plan to murder Elizabeth, the dispatch, as he put it, of the usurping competitor, and he asked for the captive queen's approval. And here Walsingham held his breath, because everything depended on how Mary answered. Had she been cautious, had she written nothing that could be construed as consent to murder, the trap would have failed. But Mary, after years of frustration, with deliverance seeming at last within reach, made the error that ended her. She wrote back. She wrote a long reply approving the general design of her own rescue, and the rising and discussing the practical arrangements, and in doing so she crossed the line that Walsingham needed her to cross, for whatever the precise force of her words, she had associated herself, in her own ciphered hand, with a conspiracy whose stated aim was the death of the Queen of England. When the deciphered copy of that letter reached Walsingham, he is said to have drawn upon it the sign of a gallows, a small mark of grim triumph, for he knew that he had her at last. Even then he waited, holding back the arrests until he had let the plot ripen as far as it safely could, gathering every name and every thread. He even had Philippes add a forged postscript to Mary's letter, by some accounts requesting the names of the gentlemen who would carry out the assassination, to draw out the conspirators more fully, though whether that forgery was ever sent is disputed. Then the net closed. Babington and his companions were hunted down, arrested, tried, and put to death in the late summer of 1586. And Mary, who had been lured out on a hunt, one of the small liberties still permitted her, was taken into custody as she rode, her papers seized, her secretaries arrested, her household broken up. She returned from that ride a different kind of prisoner. The long ambiguity was over. She was no longer merely an inconvenient royal guest held in honourable confinement. She was an accused traitor, caught in writing, and she was going to be tried for her life. There remained, however, a profound difficulty, and it went to the heart of everything that the 16th century believed about kingship. Mary was a queen. She was an anointed sovereign, set apart and made sacred by her coronation, answerable, in the thinking of the age, to God alone and to no earthly court. By what right could she be tried at all? By what authority could the subjects of one realm sit in judgment upon the crowned queen of another? This was no mere technicality. It was the deepest objection Mary herself would raise, and she would raise it with magnificent force, and there was real substance to it, for if a queen could be tried and executed by a foreign power, then the whole sacred edifice of monarchy, on which Elizabeth's own safety rested, was thrown into question. To get around it, Elizabeth's government had prepared the ground in advance. They had passed an act for the Queen's safety, which provided that anyone who plotted against Elizabeth, or in whose name and for whose benefit such a plot was made, might be tried by a commission of nobles and put to death. And they had circulated, some years earlier, a remarkable document called the Bond of Association, by which thousands of Englishmen had sworn to hunt down and kill anyone who attempted Elizabeth's life, or who stood to gain by her death, a public oath that named no name but pointed, unmistakably, at the prisoner in the Midlands. The law had been shaped, deliberately, to fit the woman they meant to destroy, and in the autumn of 1586, Mary was moved to the place where it would be applied to her, the great castle of Fotheringhay in Northamptonshire, a strong and ancient fortress on the river Nene, where she would be tried, and where, as it turned out, she would die. They brought her to Fotheringhay in the autumn, and it is worth pausing on the place itself, for it was here that everything ended, and the name has carried a weight of sorrow ever since. It was a great castle in Northamptonshire, walled and strong, set on the bank of the river Nene, with a tall stone keep raised on an ancient earthwork mound and a broad hall where the business of her death would be transacted. There was nothing remarkable in it as prisons went. She had known grander and meaner, but it was the last of them, and something in the air of those final months seems to have told everyone, herself included, that she would not leave it alive. Her health was failing badly now. She could scarcely walk, and had to be carried much of the time, a woman of 43 so worn by illness and confinement that she seemed far older, grey and stooped and swollen. The dazzling girl of Notre Dame buried somewhere deep inside the broken body of an invalid. It is one of history's small cruelties that Fotheringhay no longer stands. Within a few decades of Mary's death, the castle was dismantled, its stone carried away, until nothing remained but the grassy mound and a fragment of masonry beside the quiet river, so that the visitor today, who goes looking for the place where the Queen of Scots was tried and executed, finds almost nothing: a field, a hummock, a few stones, the slow brown water of the Nene sliding past as it slid past on the morning she died. There is a strange fitness in that emptiness. The men who killed her tried to erase every trace of her, burning her clothes and her blood and scattering the ashes, and time has gone further still and erased even the building where it happened, so that the great stage of her final act has been swept entirely away. Only the story remains, told and retold, more durable than any castle, and the empty green mound by the river, where, if you stand quietly, you may feel the weight of what was done there 4 centuries ago, in a hall that no longer exists, to a queen whom history has never been able to forget. The trial opened in the middle of October 1586, in a chamber of Fotheringhay Castle, and Mary faced it alone, denied counsel, denied access to the evidence in advance, denied any of the protections that even an ordinary defendant might expect. A sick woman of 43, so crippled now by her ailments that she had to be helped to her chair, confronting a tribunal of some of the greatest peers and lawyers of England arrayed against her. She had no one, and yet, by every account that survives, including those of her enemies, she rose to the occasion with a dignity and an intelligence and a courage that turned the proceedings, in a moral sense, if not a legal one, entirely on their heads. She refused, at first, to recognize the court at all. She stood upon her sovereignty. She declared that she was a queen, an absolute princess, subject to no one, and that to submit to trial by Elizabeth's commissioners would be to betray the dignity of every monarch in Christendom and to dishonour her own royal estate. "I am a queen," she told them, "and not a subject, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths than acknowledge myself a subject." It was unanswerable, in its way, and the commissioners had no real reply to it, only the brute fact of their power and their instructions to proceed regardless. When she did at last consent to answer the charges, in order, she said, to clear her honour before the world, she defended herself with a skill that her unschooled and unsupported position made all the more astonishing. She denied any part in any plot to take Elizabeth's life. She demanded to see the originals of the letters produced against her, and was refused. She pointed out with deadly accuracy that the only evidence of her supposed consent to murder consisted of copies and deciphered transcripts, prepared by her enemies, with the originals conveniently unavailable, and the confessions of her secretaries, extracted under who knew what pressure, and in her absence she insisted that her words had been twisted, that letters had been tampered with, that she was being condemned on manufactured evidence by men determined to have her blood. She was, in much of this, almost certainly right, at least as to the methods, whatever the underlying truth of her involvement in the Babington design. But it made no difference, because the verdict was never in doubt. The trial was not an inquiry into whether Mary was guilty. It was a ceremony to clothe a decision already taken. After 2 days, the commissioners adjourned to London, and there, a few weeks later, they pronounced Mary Stuart guilty of compassing and imagining the death of the Queen of England, and sentenced her to die. She fought them for 2 days, alone and unaided, and the more one learns of how she conducted herself, the more remarkable it appears. For she had no lawyer, no adviser, no sight of the documents in advance, no witnesses of her own, nothing but her wits and her royal will against the assembled legal might of the English crown. On the 2nd day she pressed her defence with even greater force, demanding again that the original letters be produced rather than copies, insisting that her secretaries had been coerced or had lied, pointing out that she had been allowed no counsel while her accusers had every advantage, arguing that the whole proceeding was without precedent and without lawful authority over an anointed queen of a foreign realm. She caught the commissioners out in their evasions. She appealed over their heads to the judgment of God and of posterity, declaring that she was content to have her cause tried before the courts of heaven and of history, if it could not be fairly tried before the courts of England. And when she saw that nothing she said would change the outcome, that the verdict was settled, and her words were spent upon stone, she gathered what dignity remained to her, and made her exit a kind of victory, sweeping from the chamber with the bearing of a queen having lost the trial and won, in the eyes of all who later read of it, the larger argument about who in that hall had behaved as royalty and who had behaved as something less. For that is the thing the trial revealed, and the thing her enemies could never quite undo, however the verdict went. Stripped of everything, ill, alone, condemned in advance, Mary Stuart conducted herself across those 2 days with a courage and an intelligence and a sense of her own sacred dignity that turned her judges, in the moral reckoning, into the smaller figures in the room. They had the power and the law and the foregone conclusion. She had only herself, and herself proved enough to ensure that the proceeding which was meant to brand her a traitor branded her instead, in the memory of the world, a wronged and royal woman destroyed by a process that dared not let her go free. She did not save her life. She was never going to save her life. But she saved something she valued more, her honour and her standing as a queen, and she did it with words alone in a hostile hall, with the axe already waiting. It was in its way a rehearsal for the scaffold, where she would complete in silence and in red what she had begun at the trial in argument and in defiance. And now the whole weight of the matter came to rest upon one person, and it was not Mary who had made her peace, but Elizabeth who had not. For between the sentence and its execution stood the Queen of England, and she would not sign. Through the closing months of 1586 and into the new year, Elizabeth agonized in what was surely the most genuine and prolonged crisis of conscience of her entire long reign. Her council pressed her without mercy. Parliament petitioned her. Walsingham and Burghley and all her ablest servants told her, again and again, that there could be no safety for her or for England while Mary lived, that the prisoner was the heart of every plot, and would remain so until she was dead, that to spare her was to gamble the Queen's own life and the Protestant settlement, and the peace of the realm upon the goodwill of a woman who had every reason to wish them all destroyed. And Elizabeth knew in her head that they were right, but she could not bring herself to do it. The reasons ran deep, and they were not weakness, whatever her frustrated counsellors thought. To execute Mary was to execute a fellow sovereign, an anointed queen, and to do so was to strike at the sacred principle of monarchy itself, to teach the world and her own subjects that a queen could be killed. It was to do to a cousin what had been done, within Elizabeth's own memory, to her own mother. And it was to take upon her conscience, before God, the blood of one whom she had no clear earthly right to judge. Elizabeth twisted and turned and delayed and wept and raged. She hinted, more than once and to more than one person, that she would be glad if some loyal servant would quietly relieve her of the burden, would simply make away with Mary in secret under the terms of the bond of association, sparing her the dreadful necessity of a public, signed, legal killing. No one obliged her. Mary's keeper, when the hint reached him, refused with horror to murder his prisoner without warrant, and so it came back always to the paper on the table and the pen in the Queen's hand. At last, on the 1st of February, 1587, she signed it. The warrant for the execution of the Queen of Scots was brought to her among a stack of other papers by her secretary William Davison, and she put her name to it. And then, having signed, she tried at once to push the deed away from herself, telling Davison to have it dispatched, but speaking still of her reluctance, hinting again that she wished it might be managed some other way. What happened next has been argued over ever since, and it allowed Elizabeth, in the end, to keep a sliver of her conscience clean at the cost of a faithful servant's ruin. The council, fearing that the Queen would change her mind yet again if given the smallest opening, acted with speed and secrecy. They took the signed warrant, and without waiting for any further word from Elizabeth, they sent it north to Fotheringhay, and they set the machinery of death in motion before their mistress could call it back. Whether Elizabeth truly intended the warrant to be acted upon when she signed it, or whether she signed it only to satisfy her council while privately trusting that it would not be used without her express command, is one more of the unanswerable questions that cluster around this story. What is certain is that the warrant went north, and that Mary Stuart had, though she did not yet know the day, only a handful of hours of life remaining to her. The news reached Fotheringhay on the evening of the 7th of February, 1587. The earls charged with carrying out the sentence arrived, and were admitted to Mary's presence, and they read to her the warrant for her death, and told her that she was to die the following morning, she received it, by every account, with a composure that astonished the men sent to deliver it. She did not weep. She did not plead. She had been preparing for this hour, inwardly, for years, and now that it had come, she met it almost with relief, as the end of a long captivity and the beginning, in her own faith, of a something better. She told them calmly that she had not expected the Queen of England, her sister and her cousin, to consent to her death, but that since it was so, she welcomed it, but that she was weary of the world and glad to leave it, and that she counted it an honour to shed her blood in the cause of her religion. She asked for her chaplain, that she might prepare her soul, and was refused, for her keepers would not suffer a Catholic priest to attend her even at the end, and offered her instead a Protestant minister, whom she declined, and then denied the consolation of her own faith's last rites. She set about preparing herself alone. She spent that final night putting her affairs in order, with a calm deliberateness that is, to me, among the most moving things in her whole life. She had perhaps 8 or 9 hours, and she used them well. She divided her possessions among her faithful servants, the few who had stayed with her to the end, writing out lists, distributing her money and her clothes and her small treasures, so that each would be remembered. She wrote her last letters, including a long and dignified one to her brother-in-law, the King of France, commending her servants to his care and protesting, as she had protested all along, her innocence of the crimes laid against her, and her constancy in her faith. She made her will. She wrote to the Pope. She arranged for the payment of her debts and the wages of her household. And through it all she comforted those around her, her weeping women, telling them not to grieve but to rejoice that her troubles were nearly over. Toward the small hours she lay down on her bed, still dressed, and rested a little, while one of her women read aloud to her from the lives of the saints, and she remarked, of a great sinner who had been received into grace at the last, that here was a sinner indeed, but none so great as she had been, and that she took comfort in the mercy of her Lord. She did not sleep much. When the grey light of the 8th of February began to come into the room, she rose to meet it, and dressed herself with care for her death. I want to slow us right down now, because we have come to the morning, and the morning deserves to be told fully and quietly and without flinching, and also without any of the dwelling on horror that would betray the dignity of what happened. This is the scene toward which the whole long life has been moving, from the snowbound palace and the 6-day crown all the way down the years to this cold hall in an English castle, and Mary, who had been so often the victim of events, so often carried along by forces stronger than herself, made of her own death the one thing in her life that she shaped entirely, the one performance over which she had complete command. She had decided how she would die, and she died exactly so, and in doing so she did more to win the argument of her life than all her years of struggle had ever managed. The murderess of the placards and the casket letters was, in the space of a single morning, transformed into something else entirely, into the martyr she had resolved to be, and the transformation was her own deliberate work, accomplished with a steadiness of nerve that has held the attention of the world for more than 400 years. She dressed in dark clothing, in a gown of black satin, with a long white veil flowing down behind her, carrying a crucifix and a prayer book, an ivory cross and rosary at her waist. She had her women attend to her hair and her appearance with care, for she meant to go to her death looking every inch a queen. And then, supported on either side because her failing legs could scarcely carry her, Leaning on the arms of her servants and on a staff, she made her slow way down through the castle to the great hall where the scaffold had been built, a low platform draped in black, set up before the fire, with the block upon it, and the executioner waiting, masked, beside it. Some hundreds of people had been admitted to watch, the gentry of the district crowding the hall, and Mary came among them with her head high, her face calm, moving with the terrible slow dignity of a woman who has nothing left to fear and everything left to prove. Upon the scaffold she was composed throughout. The warrant was read aloud. The Protestant Dean of Peterborough began to exhort her, pressing her even now to abandon her faith and die a Protestant, and Mary gently and firmly refused him, telling him that she was settled in the ancient Catholic religion and meant to die in it, and that he need trouble himself no further on her account. She prayed aloud, and at length, in Latin and then in English, for the Church, for her son James, and with a generosity that silenced the hall, for Elizabeth herself, that her cousin might long prosper and serve God. She forgave the executioner, as custom required, and gave him her pardon for what he was about to do. Her women came forward, weeping to help her prepare, to remove her black outer gown, and it was then that the watching crowd drew its breath, for beneath the black Mary was clothed from head to foot in deep crimson red, the colour, in the iconography of the Catholic Church, of martyrdom and of the blood of the saints. Whether she had planned it so, and it is hard to believe she had not, she stood revealed at the last, not as a condemned criminal, but as a martyr arrayed in the colour of sacrifice, and the image of it has never faded in all the centuries since. A cloth was bound over her eyes. She knelt and felt for the block and laid her head upon it and spoke her last words, the words of the dying Christ and of the psalm, "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." And the sentence was carried out, and the Queen of Scots was dead. She was 44 years old. She had been a queen for 44 years and a captive for 19 of them, and her death, on that cold February morning in the year 1587, closed a life that had held within it more reversal and more sorrow and more sheer dramatic incident than the lives of a dozen ordinary mortals. And then, in the silence that followed, came the detail that I promised you at the very beginning of our evening, the small, strange, tender thing that has fixed this scene in the human imagination more deeply, perhaps, than all the grandeur and all the politics. When it was over, and the attendants moved to gather up the body, they found that something was hidden beneath the dead queen's skirts, pressed close against her, and it was her little dog, a small Skye terrier, which had followed her unseen to the scaffold and crept under her clothing and stayed there through everything, and which now would not be coaxed away, but lay between the head and the shoulders of its mistress, and had to be carried off by force, and which afterward, the accounts tell us, refused to eat and pined and would not be comforted. There is no moral to draw from it. It is simply true, and it is the kind of small true thing that cuts straight through 400 years to the living heart of the matter, that here was a woman who, whatever she had done or failed to do, was loved, faithfully and to the last, by a creature that knew nothing of crowns or plots or religion, and would not leave her even in death. They burned everything afterward. This was no idle cruelty but cold calculation. Mary's enemies understood very well the power of relics, the danger that anything touched by her blood might become a sacred object to the Catholics, who already regarded her as a martyr, a focus for devotion and for further plots. And so the executioner's block, the scaffold cloths, her clothing, everything that the blood had touched, was gathered up and burned, and the ashes scattered, and the little dog washed, so that nothing should remain to be venerated. they were too late. The relic they could not burn was the story itself, and it was already loose in the world, carried by every person who had stood in that hall, and within weeks it was being told across Europe, and Mary Stuart, who had lost every earthly contest she ever entered, had won in death the one that mattered most to her, the contest for how she would be remembered. When the news was at last brought to Elizabeth, she fell into a paroxysm of grief and rage that her own court found hard to read, and historians have argued over ever since. She wept. She put on mourning. She declared that she had never intended the warrant to be acted upon, that it had been sent without her knowledge and against her wishes, that her servants had betrayed her trust and rushed her cousin to death behind her back, and she turned the full force of her fury upon poor William Davison, the secretary who had carried the signed warrant, casting him into the Tower and ruining him, making of him the scapegoat for a deed that the whole council had shared in, and that she herself had set in motion with her own pen. How much of Elizabeth's grief was genuine remorse, and how much was a careful performance designed to distance herself from the killing of an anointed queen and to placate the outraged courts of Catholic Europe, no one can finally say, and the truth is most likely that it was both at once, real and calculated together. For Elizabeth was a creature of extraordinary complexity, and rarely felt only one thing at a time. She had wanted Mary dead, and she had dreaded Mary's death, and now that it was done, she mourned the cousin she had destroyed and feared the consequences of the destroying, and both feelings were true. The two queens who had circled each other for 30 years, who had written and schemed and pleaded and threatened and never once met, were parted at last by the axe, and the survivor wore black for the one she had sent to the block. And the strangeness of that has never quite been resolved, and perhaps never can be. The thing they could not burn, as I said, was the story, and the story did exactly what Mary had hoped it would. Across Catholic Europe, she was proclaimed a martyr almost at once. Her death held up as proof of the cruelty of the heretic English queen, her image printed and circulated, her last hours recounted and embellished and held to the light as evidence of her sanctity. In England, where the official line was that a dangerous traitor had been justly punished, the matter was more delicate. But even there the sympathy was real and would only grow with time, for there is something in the spectacle of a queen meeting her death with that much courage that overrides in the end the arguments about her guilt. The propaganda war over Mary Stuart began the moment the axe fell, and it has never entirely stopped. She passed at once out of history and into legend, and the legend has proven far more durable than any verdict, the beautiful tragic queen, betrayed and beheaded, who forgave her enemies and went to her death in martyr's red, with her little dog hidden in her skirts. Whatever the truth of her life, this is what survived of her, and it survived because she willed it to, in those last calm hours when she shaped her own ending into the one unanswerable argument of her existence. And then, 16 years later, came the irony that crowns the whole story, the turn of the wheel that no one could have predicted, and that gave Mary, in defeat and death, the victory she had reached for all her life. In the spring of 1603, the old Queen of England, Elizabeth, died at length after a reign of nearly 45 years, unmarried and childless to the end, the last of the Tudors. And the crown of England, the crown that Mary had claimed and quartered and schemed for and been imprisoned and executed over, the crown she had never once been permitted to touch, passed peacefully and without a drop of blood to her son. James VI of Scotland became also James I of England. The two ancient enemy kingdoms united in a single person, and that person was the child Mary had borne in the fortress on the rock and lost, when he was 10 months old and never seen again. Everything she had wanted, her son inherited. The throne she died claiming, he ascended. The union of the crowns that had been the dream and the terror of both kingdoms for centuries was accomplished, and it was accomplished through her blood and her line, through the one child of her disastrous marriages. She had failed at everything, and her failure had founded a dynasty. The Stuarts would sit on the throne of a united Britain, in one form or another, for the next 110 years, and every one of them descended from the Queen who had been beheaded at Fotheringhay as a traitor. History has few jokes grimmer or grander than that. Her son, who had let her die, did one thing for her in the end, though it took him almost a decade, and one suspects his motives were as much about his own dignity as about her memory. In 1612, James had his mother's body taken up from its first resting place in Peterborough Cathedral and carried south to Westminster Abbey, to the very heart of the English royal mausoleum, and there he raised over her a magnificent marble tomb, a white effigy of the Queen lying in state beneath a great canopy, grander, as it happens, than the monument he raised to Elizabeth, who lies not far away in the same abbey. And so the two queens came at last to rest within a few yards of each other, under the same ancient roof, the cousins who had circled one another for 30 years and never met, who had written and schemed and feared and, in a way, needed each other, parted in life by a border neither would cross and joined in death by the son of one and the throne of both. But aye, there still, you can go and stand between them. Elizabeth in one aisle, Mary in the other, the victor and the vanquished, the survivor and the martyr, the two most formidable women of their age, quiet at last beneath their carved stone, the long quarrel ended. The meeting that never happened finally, in a sense, achieved. I find that there is more poetry in that arrangement than in anything either of them said or did in life. Death does not reconcile them, exactly, but it does set them down side by side, and lets the centuries decide between them, and the centuries have, on the whole, declined to choose. There is one more thing I want to leave with you before the night closes, and it is a phrase, a motto, that Mary chose for herself and stitched, with her own hands, into one of her embroideries during the long years of her captivity. It was written in French, and it said this: "In my end is my beginning." She meant it, surely, as a statement of her faith, the Christian conviction that death is not an ending but a passage, that the close of this life opens upon another. But it has come to mean more than that, because it turned out, against every probability, to be true in this world as well as the next. Her end was her beginning. The death that her enemies intended as the final extinguishing of her cause became, instead, the foundation of her legend and the vindication of her line. The scaffold at Fotheringhay was not the end of Mary Stuart. It was the moment she began to win. The Queen who lost every battle she fought while living triumphed in the only way that was left to her, by dying well, and by leaving behind a son who would gather up all the crowns she had failed to hold, and by becoming, across 4 centuries, one of the most beloved and most argued over figures in the whole history of these islands. In my end is my beginning. She stitched it in thread in a cold house with failing hands, not knowing how completely the words would come true. So let us leave her there, as the evening draws to its close, and let the story settle in you slowly, as you drift towards sleep. Let your mind go back over the whole long arc of it, the way one does at the end of a life, the snow on the loch at Linlithgow and the 6-day crown, the golden years on the rivers of France, and the white wedding at Notre Dame, the farewell wept at the rail of a departing ship, the fog at Leith, and the granite preacher, and the doomed marriages, the blade through the body of a friend, the child born in the fortress, the explosion in the night and the surrender on the hill, the island prison and the dark water and the rout at Langside, the fishing boat across the Firth into a captivity that lasted 19 years, the embroidery and the little dogs and the letters sent out into the dark, and at the last the red gown beneath the black and the steady voice commending her spirit, and the small, faithful creature that would not leave her even then. One human life held up to the light, more sorrow in it than seems fair, and more courage than seems possible, and at the centre of it, a woman who was, for all her crowns, simply a person, who loved and erred and suffered and endured, and who met the worst that the world could do to her with a dignity that has outlasted everyone who wished her harm. These evenings are reconstructions, you understand, built carefully out of the letters and the records and the testimony that survive, and where the record falls silent, as it so often does, I have tried to fill the silence honestly with what is most likely, rather than what is most dramatic, and to tell you plainly when no one can be sure. The woman was real, the grief was real, the courage was real. If you have found something here worth returning to, you are always welcome to come back and to stay, so that the next of these long, quiet journeys finds you when it comes. There is no hurry. There never is. Here. For now, though, the candles are burning low, and the story is told, and there is nothing left for you to do but rest. You have travelled 4.5 centuries tonight, and a whole life with them, and you have earned the quiet that is coming. Let your breathing slow. Let the weight of the day and the weight of the story settle and drift away. She is at peace now, has been these 400 years, lying in her marble quiet beneath the old stone roof, and you may be at peace too. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.